one.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more from across those divided states as well as across the fragmented surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, first up in the headlines this morning and in COVID news, first of all, at least 2,048 new coronavirus deaths and 222,900 new cases were reported in the United States on January 11th, yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 250,000 cases per day, an increase of 37% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Tuesday morning, more than 22,673,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and more than 376,000 have died from it. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa extended coronavirus restrictions in the country Monday, citing a quote-unquote massive increase in COVID-19 cases driven by a variant discovered there last year. The current measures were due to expire on January 15th and include closing beaches and public parks and banning the sale of alcohol. In addition to extending the existing measures, Ramaphosa announced that 20 land borders will be closed until February 15th. Malaysia's king declared a nationwide state of emergency today to curb the spread of COVID-19. That's a move that bolsters Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin's hold on power and forestalls any attempt by opponents to force an early election. Muhyiddin said the parliament will be suspended for a stipulated period of time and that elections would not be held during the emergency, which could last until August 1st. Disneyland Resort in Anaheim will soon be transferred into a mass coronavirus vaccination site for Southern California residents, Orange County officials announced Monday. And Indiana is the latest state to report its first case of a more contagious COVID-19 variant first identified in the United Kingdom, upping the total of states that have identified the strain up to 10. Two Democratic Congresswomen, Representative Pramila Jayapal of the Seattle area and Representative Bonnie Watson-Coleman of New Jersey, have tested positive for COVID-19 after sheltering in place with fellow lawmakers during the attack on the U.S. Capitol last week. Bonnie Watson-Coleman is 75 years old. In national political news, President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence spoke Monday evening in the Oval Office, their first meeting since the assaults on the Capitol last week. House Republicans, meanwhile, blocked a resolution from Democratic Representative Jamie Raskin to call on Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove the president from office. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said the House will vote today and could proceed with impeachment of Pence if Pence doesn't act. How do you think that's going to go, Jamarl? Impeachment, I mean.
They're not going to act. I don't think Pence is going to take Trump out. I don't buy it for a moment. I think Pence may be very angry. I think he may be very upset at Trump throwing him overboard in the way that he did. I mean, after all, Pence was there when the mob attacked it. But I don't believe for one moment that these guys are going to go through and take Trump out. Pelosi is going to have to do it herself, and I don't even believe Pelosi has the votes for it. That's my thought.
All right.
How
Fair
about
enough.
you? You think Pence is going to go through with it? I don't buy it.
I don't buy it either. No, I don't think he will. But it's significant enough in the fact that I don't think that Pence has any personal allegiance to Trump. I don't think he ever has really. And I think that was shown pretty clearly here. And I think that after Trump pushed back on Pence so damn strongly the day of the events, Wednesday, calling him a coward effectively, saying, if he had the courage to stand up for Trump, that would have been a good thing. Anyway, I don't think he has any personal allegiance, but politically, I think it's still a little bit necessary for him to not do that.
Right there. But see, I do think he has political allegiance. Because think about it. Pence has stood beside Trump the entire way through. I think the thing is, does political allegiance mean you have to set yourself on fire for the other person, especially if you think they're lying? That's the catch. Meaning, I may trust you, I may like you, I may feel a certain allegiance to you, and with everything that's, within the politics of it all, you got me. But the moment that you go with this idea that I'm going to steal an election or cheat, well, that's beyond the pale. And it could be beyond the pale from even the standpoint of Pence. I mean, Pence was able to make his career based on the way politics is currently established. Donald Trump is trying to do something fundamentally different, which is basically trying to break any notion of our political system. Whether you like it or dislike it, Pence was able to succeed in that political system. So he may not agree with any of this, despite the fact that he's not necessarily saying anything openly against Trump. Meaning the allegiance is him not repudiating or attacking Trump, just because I don't think he necessarily buys this premise. But I don't think him not buying the premise is in and of itself enough to say he doesn't have any allegiance to him. I think he does, but I could be wrong.
I think he has like I was saying, I think he has some political allegiance. I don't think he has any personal allegiance. It's a weird line to straddle there, but I do not think that at this point he has many or any positive feelings about Trump after everything that's happened here. With again, Trump supporters acting on the same day as the president said he loved them, reportedly coming to the White House to string out Vice President Pence based on what Trump had said about him. So again, I'm not trying to.
No, I understand what you mean.
Yeah,
he's
words.
Greatly angry at Trump. I mean, that's basically what the reporting said, that he was greatly angry.
Yeah.
But the reason he was angry is because he felt, I backed this guy the entire way through. I had to have debates where I had to back this guy the entire way through. And for something like this, he just throws me over a bus in a heartbeat, doesn't think twice about it. Yeah, I think he's angry at him. He has a right to be angry at him.
That is Trump's way. That is historically Trump's way. So in that sense, I don't think Pence is surprised by that. But I do agree with you. I think he's angry. In other national political news, yesterday, U.S. President-elect Joe Biden announced William Burns as his pick to lead the CIA. Burns is a former ambassador to Russia and Jordan who helped lead secret talks with Iran. Burns, in partnership with Biden's nominee for Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, will likely be tasked with rebuilding the U.S. spy community's reputation. Let's see about that. Former Republican Congressman Ron Paul says he's been blocked by Facebook from managing his account over repeated violations of the social media giant's quote-unquote community standards. Quote, with no explanation other than repeatedly going against our community standards, Facebook has blocked me from managing my page. Never have we received notice of violating community standards in the past, and nowhere is the offending post identified, end quote. That's from Paul writing on Twitter on Monday. The column that Paul had posted Monday to his Facebook page was about tech censorship and his concerns about that. And again, that posting that article to his Facebook page was apparently followed shortly by having his personal access to that page blocked. That page is still up, by the way. So the Ron Paul, Facebook page, that itself is still up, but he can't post there because Facebook has blocked that. So another worrying sign, it could be a fluke. Sometimes their ban, detection algorithm goes off erroneously, but don't want to assume that after everything that's been happening. And if this is intentional, that's pretty ugly tech censorship right there. Basically censoring somebody for complaining about tech censorship. In international political news today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu changed his cover photo in Twitter, which was a joint photo of himself sitting next to Trump at a White House meeting. It is now a picture of Netanyahu receiving the vaccine with the phrase, quote, citizens of Israel, we are returning to life. end quote. The head of Egypt's Civil Aviation Authority, Ashraf Nair, announced on Tuesday that Cairo has resumed air service with Qatar and lifted the air embargo imposed on flights of Qatar's airlines to the North African country following the over 3-year freeze. In 2017, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt cut diplomatic ties with Qatar, accusing it of meddling and sponsoring terrorism. Several other countries later did the same, while others downgraded their diplomatic ties with Doha and introduced a total blockade of the country. Doha has consistently denied the accusations, insisting that the neighbor's discontent with its economic successes was behind their hostile policies. In tech news, Facebook announced on Monday that it will begin removing any and all content that contains the phrase "Stop the Steal" from its platform in the days leading up to Inauguration Day on January 20th, 2021. That's a pretty blanket case of censorship there, just removing any post that contains that phrase. Hashtag Stop the Steal. Not that I'm actually think that was what was going on. By the way, what happened last Wednesday, I would say, Jamarl, was a combination of the Stop the Steal and force the vote movements. It was something like force the steal and stop the vote at the same time, if you remember, where they were stopping the House of Representatives from confirming the Electoral College vote, and then they were forcing the steal by Trump. I just wanted to throw that in there. Anyway, our last tech headline, a company in Hangzhou, China named Hebo Technology developed in-house and distributed smart cushions equipped with sensors to its employees to help users keep an eye on their heart rate, breathing, posture, and fatigue levels, and also had the ability to prompt users to stand and stretch if they've sat down for too long. But employees soon found out that the cushions were actually being used to spy on their activity during work after their superiors always seemed to know exactly when they were away from their desk. One employee took to social media and wrote about how she was confronted by a colleague from Human Resources, HR, who asked her why she'd been away from her desk every morning from 10 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. The colleague apparently even jokingly threatened that her bonus would be cut because of it. I think that's the sign of more that's to come. Personally, I don't think that's the end of that type of technology. But with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. What do you think, Jamarl? Do you think invasive technology is something that we're going to see more of in the future? That's kind of a dummy question, but what's your take?
Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't they do that? From the standpoint of the company, look, I keep telling people, if they could save a nickel putting in a robot, they would save a nickel putting in a robot. And while you have that person in and you can't replace that person with a robot, what do you try to do as a company? I want to try to commodify. This is in person. I want to turn this person into a machine as much as I could turn this person into a machine. So I want to keep track on the person's form. Maybe a certain form gives me a higher percentage with, over the course of a year, that percentage of extra productivity gains X amount of profit. And I know that's based on stats, that if this person is out of the chair for X amount of time over the course of a day, that it cuts my productivity by a certain rate. I mean, why wouldn't they do that? I mean, from their standpoint, they're looking at this as, how do I maximize my profit? And if maximizing your profit means keeping track of your employees' actions and keeping, let's say, more control over that, why wouldn't you do that? Perfect example, my wife. The company that my wife works for, my wife, she works remotely. Works at home. The company added in technology to ensure that while she's at home and while she's working at home, that they can't do other stuff. So she can't check her email. She can't check her, let's say, some other site to look at other news and stuff like that. They've basically isolated and boxed the computer in to prevent them from doing anything else. My other job was the same way. They were monitoring each and every person in regards to what the person did. So if the person tried to use, let's say, listen to music while they were at work, that was frowned upon. Amazon, didn't they do the same thing? Added like sensors into individuals so they would get like a shock if they were spending too much time away or were doing something else that they weren't supposed to be doing. Companies are going to do this. What is the employee going to do? They can either quit and go hungry, or they can either stay and they can work. And if that employee quits, I guarantee you there's somebody else who's desperate enough to take that job, meaning there's no pushback against any of this. All of this is going to be accepted by employees who will grudgingly have to sit there and complain, but need the paycheck. Yes, this is the ghost of Christmas future, if you want to call it that. That's my thought.
It's true.
I mean, that's grim, that's cynical, but I have a hard time seeing how I'm wrong in that.
No, I think you're right. Like I said, it was kind of a dummy question. I mean, we're already seeing this stuff, and we've been seeing this stuff, frankly, for centuries in different forms. Whether it's the managers of factories or the scientific efficiency movement under Frederick Winslow Taylor, trying to push people to their limits in order to extract out of them the most that you possibly can. That's probably, if I had to choose one pivotal complaint of capitalism, that would be it. Although there are a couple others, and frankly, I would say it's a symptom of a deeper underlying problem, which is not necessarily just the pursuit of profit, but the pursuit of power. Pursuit of power can also push you to do this exact same thing if people are under you in an army or any kind of organization. But profit introduces a much more quantifiable way to pursue that power. With that, we're going into a break.
Profit is the pursuit of power. I mean, at this point, profit is just, I mean, look, money isn't real. And so if we're talking about profit, we're talking about a proxy for something else. It's just this idea that people would be able to, you could use power and energy from people under this agreement that because you have the cash that they'll be able to do X, Y, Z. I think it is. I think they're the same thing. I think one is just an allegory for the other. What do you think I'm wrong?
I hear you. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, but we should go into a break. This is a conversation that we have occasionally. We've been having it for months now. We'll have time to come back to it either later during the show or in future days. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute with Jamarl's Soapbox segment.
Fault Lines. Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Well, we're a few days out from the failed putsch, the attempt to take it all that Donald Trump basically was trying to get some of the elements in power, meaning the likes of Pence and many of the other Republicans, be it in the Senate or in the House, to basically aid him in this attempt to overturn the results of the election, something that should not be undermined, meaning you shouldn't understate the significance of what that is. That is basically the destruction of this country. Now we have consequences. Several days out, what have been the consequences for that failed putsch, that failed attempt on the sovereignty of this country? Well, Face Paint Man, I don't know if you remember who Face Paint Man is. That's the guy who was walking through with the face paint and the Native American items. Well, Face Paint Man is named Jacob Anthony Chansley, also known as Jake Angel, or the QAnon Shaman. Now, the QAnon Shaman, his mom, he lives with his mom, and his mom basically made the point that said he hasn't eaten since Friday, and he gets very sick if he doesn't eat organic food. Literally will get physically ill. His mother, Martha Chansley, told reporters, according to ABC 15 in Phoenix. So the U.S. Marshals will be giving him an organic meal, an organic diet, while he's in prison or jail. Astonishing. You have other people who are freaking out because of no-fly lists, where they were getting or trying to get on an airplane and realize, oh, right, I just participated in a failed insurrection. I tried to take the Capitol and prevent them from voting, sending Congress members fleeing into a safe room. And I thought I'd be able to just go home without any consequences. Yeah, a no-fly list for many of those people. You have the other situation where the gentleman, Johnson, was walking through with a lectern. This is the one that picked up Nancy Pelosi's lectern and was walking around with pictures being taken of him. Listen to this gentleman's lawyer, Adam Johnson's lawyer. Listen to what he's telling the press. Let's play the clip.
Part of what you have to, factor into is, again, you just have to drill down on what actually happened. You have a photograph of our client, in a building, unauthorized to be there with, what appears to be a podium or a lectern. I'm not exactly sure which one it is called, but that's what we have.
Obviously, that presents problems for you as a defense attorney in that you have your client in the building at the time of the break-in.
I don't know how to else explain that, but yeah, that would be a problem. I'm not a magician, and neither is Mr. Bigney. So yeah, we've got a photograph of our client who appears to be inside the federal building or inside the Capitol with government property.
He says, look, I'm not a magician. And I love the fact how he casually just admits, I have a photograph of my client in the room with the lectern or whatever you want to call it. I'm not a magician. He's not a magician. So yeah, we're going to have difficulty explaining that. Yes, you're going to have difficulty explaining that. I think it's funny that the lawyer admitted that his client was in there. I think that's the funnier part. You also have people like Judge Janine, who in one sense was very clear that no, this wasn't Antifa or anybody else. This was your fault. Telling her audience, very clear. But in the other sense, dealing with the consequences of this and the censorship that's coming as a result of this failed attempt. Look, any lefty that knows anything about lefty history will tell you that the state becomes far more repressive the moment that there has been an attack on a state, especially if it's a strong central state. It takes that stuff very seriously. The people who are a part of that state, for the first time in a very long time, feel uncomfortable. And as such, they're going to respond. Well, this is the response. Now, Judge Janine has gotten to the point of screaming that the blowback to a literal attack on the Capitol is somehow synonymous with Nazis. Let's play the clip. I want you to hear this. This is profound.
Let's bring in Judge Janine Pirro, host of Justice with Judge Janine. Good morning, Judge.
Good morning.
Good morning. What's your reaction to that? Parler shut down.
Well, look, they gave us a taste of this pre-election when they suppressed the Hunter Biden story. And now that they've won, what we're seeing is a kind of censorship that is akin to a crystal knock, where they decide what we can communicate about.
This woman is a lunatic. Honestly, either her audience, she believes that her audience is so stupid as to not know what crystal knot is, represents, or the context surrounding it. And I got to be honest, I don't even see how the two are related. Crystal knot, if I'm not mistaken, is a night of broken glass. This is when Nazis, under Hitler, went bananas, killing, maiming, and basically breaking all sorts of glass of various shops, Jewish shops in Germany. This is what she is giving a comparison to the shutting, to Hunter Biden, to not exposing the Hunter Biden stuff. That's one part. And also the shutting down of Parler. Now, is it possible to take issue with potentially the shutting down of Parler, or for that matter, the not showing the Hunter Biden stuff, but not comparing it to a night where Jews were killed and their businesses and shops were utterly destroyed? That is profound. Profoundly stupid, but profound nonetheless. Let's go to the next one. You have Chris Christie, turn of the worm. Now, all of these Republicans, under normal circumstances, that was under the thumb of Trump because they feared the political force of him coming out on Twitter. Meaning he comes out on Twitter, says something bad about you, you may lose that election. He sends his kids, or he himself goes and campaigns against you. You may lose that election. Donald Trump, whatever you want to think of him, is a political, or the very least was, a political juggernaut. And because he was so strong politically, many of the Republicans, whether they liked him or not, had to toe the line. Looking at you, Lindsey Graham. Looking at you, Mitch McConnell. Also, Chris Christie. If you remember, Chris Christie was the one that had to stand beside Donald Trump behind him in this humiliating speech where he stood there for like 15 minutes with facial expressions, or where Donald Trump tells him, all right, Christie, you can get lost at the airport. Meaning, Chris Christie, tough man from Jersey, became the butt of Donald Trump's jokes, become the henchman that was basically humiliated one time after the next, despite the fact that this guy was governor. He felt he needed to do it. He might have even thought he was going to get something out of it. He did not. He did get something out of it, a lot of humiliation. So now, Chris Christie, given the opportunity when Donald Trump has lost the election, Donald Trump has basically failed in a coup attempt. The turn of the worm. Let's hear Christie.
Trump right now, but if an impeachment resolution actually comes to the floor, won't many Republicans be hard-pressed to oppose it?
Yeah, listen, I think they're all going to have to vote their conscience and look at what happened. I mean, what we had was an incitement to riot at the United States Capitol. We had people killed, and to me, there's not a whole lot of question here. So, you know. So
you think it was an impeachable offense?
I've said before, Jordan. Oh, sure, yeah, and
you'd vote to impeach.
I think that, you know, that's, if I think it's an impeachable offense, that's exactly what I would do, George. But I'm not in there. But you want my opinion? That's my opinion. I think if inciting to insurrection isn't, then I don't really know what is.
If inciting an insurrection isn't grounds for impeachment, I don't know what is. And he's right, right? Here's the problem that I think a lot of people are going to have to deal with. This is Congress. These people got their jobs and got their position by being within the system. And if you're going to have a situation where some congressman or the president himself is going to try to overturn that system that they were able to get power and authority in, they are going to have issues with that. So despite the fact that they may have problems with Trump, they may not say those problems. But now that stuff becomes fair game. You have congressmen that were rushed into the safe room. Those congressmen, many of the Republicans, were not wearing masks and were openly deriding the people who was trying to hand out the mask. Now we find out that some of the members that were in that safe room were apparently infected with COVID, including the person who, the creator of Medicare for All in the House of Representatives, Jamarl. Jamarl has been infected with COVID-19 as a result of her being in the safe room, apparently with many of the other people, particularly the Republicans, that weren't wearing masks. You also have Pelosi basically telling Pence that, look, if you don't take him out, we will, and is putting out articles of impeachment. But there's something else beyond the articles of impeachment that I think people aren't entirely paying attention to, but they should, because it's vitally important. 14th Amendment. Pelosi, in that letter, also invoked the 14th Amendment, Section 3. Now, that has to do with any congressman or any particular person that was in government that was part of an insurrection can be taken out and will be disallowed in getting back into governmental service. That's not just Trump. She's looking at the members of Congress that were involved in that process. Now, don't misunderstand me. It's one thing for a congressman to basically say, to back Trump on this thing. But are you backing him because of political reasons, or are you backing him because you honestly and legitimately think that he lost? And the problem is, you could take that position. You have all sorts of congressmen who, in the past, who have stood up and say, hey, there was a problem with this particular election. They did it in 2001 under Gore. They did it again. But if you remember, the Democrat gavelled each and every one of them down and would not let them go further. That's not what happened here. Not only did they go further from the standpoint of sending it to the Senate, which in and of itself is not that big of a deal, even though it's taboo, the president was trying to get the vice president to basically steal the election. And on top of that, use the mob to incite a riot, to raid the Capitol, to add that much more violence and force behind the intention. Yeah, this is problematic. These are the consequences. These consequences are not the end of it, end of it, the elimination of Parler, the attacks on the various organizations, and they will go beyond just the regular periodicals. You're going to get things that are on the left, like Telesur getting taken off at that one time, Press TV getting taken off. It's not going to be limited to issues on the right. Shane, what do you think? These are the consequences. These are just the beginning consequences. And by the way, I agree with Pelosi on the 14th Amendment thing. These guys actively tried to take down the government of the United States. There should be consequences. That's my thought. What do you think?
I think, yeah, 100% there will be. This is the start of the political consequences. I think more worrying, honestly, are the informational consequences in terms of tech coming down on particular figures, alternative platforms, and just generally trying to suppress movements. That's been going on for a while, of course, but it seems to be accelerating pretty quickly here. So if I had to choose one thing to be worried about on the other side of last Wednesday's events, it would be that. And then there's just the general continued decline in our ability to communicate as a nation. But that's also been going on for a long time, since long before 2016, I would argue. But yeah, politically, these are the start of the consequences of that. Anything I'm missing? Undoubtedly, there is. You could lament the decline of American democracy as a whole, or whatever. You can, talk about that. But what do you think, Jamarl, before we go into our break?
I do think there are things that are missing. I agree with you with the big tech. I think the big tech merging with the government is going to be huge in regards to what they consider that they want to censor, what they decide they won't want to play out, meaning, the Hunter Biden thing was horrendous. And indicative of somewhere that I don't necessarily think we want to go. I don't think we've seen the end of this. This is basically the pushback from, you've given government under a Democratic House, Senate, and presidency a certain justification, or let's say an argument that would allow them to repress. And I think that's what you're going to see, especially from the standpoint of content. But let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest. We are joined by Maram Susli, political commentator and geopolitical analyst, who you can follow, by the way, on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. Find on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan, and support on patreon.com/Syrian Girl. Maram, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Not bad, thank you. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, good overall, I've got to say.
In spite of the circumstance?
In spite of the circumstance, and the circumstances keep piling up. I'll put it like that. How are you doing in spite of all circumstances? Although I think you're weathering the storm a bit further away from it than us in the United States.
Very further.
How are things going on?
I have basically a bird's eye view of what's happening over there in the U.S. And given that I experienced sort of a civil war, well, not sort of, well, it was a world war on Syria. I have a bit of knowledge about what you guys are going through that I hope I can offer some of my experience.
Well, that would be useful. That's a great start. Go ahead, Jamarl.
Well, I was going to say her knowledge of this goes in a very particular direction on this. I'm really curious about your perspective on this. Honestly, your perspective on this, and I'm not saying you would give it honestly. We were instrumental, let's say under Obama, in putting $1 billion. The New York Times gave this article that the Obama administration put in like $1 billion in a secret campaign to basically take down Assad, where 500,000 Syrians died as a result of our interaction in your country and pushing that civil war. Meaning there might have been strife within the country, but it was very clear that the money and let's say, the money and resources we were dumping into the country definitely had an impact on infusing that civil war with foreign fighters and with all sorts of, basically it instigated a civil war in the country. What is your thoughts on what's taking place in the United States? I mean, especially given our history in involving ourselves into conflicts in your country.
Well, I did make a video where I said basically one of the main points was don't call the people that were at Capitol Hill domestic terrorists, because you have no idea what a domestic terrorist even means. Well, ours weren't even domestic. They were like mostly foreign, but we still had, some of them were domestic as well. And what they did was they slit people's throats in the street. And I'm not talking just about soldiers. I'm talking about civilians as well. They cut people's hands off. They put explosives in schools. There was a double suicide. Well, it wasn't even a suicide bombing. It was a double bombing of a school. They would bomb buses full of civilians, like 200 people, children. One of them sent his daughter, his 7-year-old daughter, rigged with explosives, like wearing an explosive belt, into a police station. And she blew herself up. She was the only one that died. But like, who would use their 7-year-old child in that situation? We're talking about swaths and swaths of territory being controlled by Al-Qaeda, and Idlib being controlled by Al-Qaeda. And yet the neocons in the US continue to deny us the right to call these people terrorists. And yet they call like just average people in the United States domestic terrorists. And these people that they're calling domestic terrorists, like the woman Ashley Babbitt that was shot, obviously they're going to count her as a domestic terrorist. You know, what did she do? But she spent 16 years serving, sacrificing for that war machine that betrayed her in the end. And look, this might be, I mean, Biden was terrible for Syria, and he will be terrible for Syria, especially because what he's going to do is he's going to push the Kurdish separatist movement, which is linked to Antifa. That's going to be his main driving force. You know, the Kurds in Syria, and they have Antifa fighters amongst them, and they also espouse like an Antifa ideology because of a guy called Murray Bookchin, whose book they idealized, and you know who met Öcalan and inspired Öcalan, the leader of the YPG, the PYD. So basically, that's going to be the next driving force for Biden to try to balkanize Syria using the Kurds. But as far as I can tell,
it seems like we're losing you. Yeah, Maram, I think we're getting some rough connections. I basically agree with everything you're saying. I'll be honest. Everything that you said so far. I don't think that the term domestic terrorist applies to pretty much the vast majority of people I saw, unless you were showing up with an intent to kill, unless you were showing up like Jamarl was commenting on, some people showing up with like zip ties and stuff where it seemed like they were going into Congress to try to lynch members of Congress. I don't think that term applies. And of course, as we were talking about the other day, Biden back in November, starting in November, trying to create a sort of new codification of what it means to be a domestic terrorist on a federal level. I'm worried that a lot of looser uses of that term are going to get swept into that definition and used to criminalize forms of speech. And I do mean speech. I don't mean speech as a sort of, act, but I mean literal speech. What with the censorship that we're seeing. And I just want to point out, even though I don't like what the Trump supporters were doing, subsequent to the March to Save America as a part of this March on Congress, I also really don't like Biden. I mean, you're talking about Biden, you're talking about what Biden has done and will do coming into the presidency. I'm also very worried about that stuff. But I'm worried, I'll put it like this. I'm worried about that. I'm also worried about the leftovers of the Trump movement. To be honest, I'm worried about like the sort of escalation of political violence, how it will be used not just against leaders, but against random members of the American public who are seen as their enemies. And it seems like there is a cycle of retributive violence that we saw occurring on the streets throughout this year that will only accelerate in the years to come. And if people were able to, and this is admittedly changing the subject slightly, or at least, bringing it back just to our domestic political concerns here in the States, but if people were able to constrain their anger and, express their anger usefully against the establishment, and if they were able to do that from both sides of the political aisle, even though that aisle is breaking down at this point, I would say that we would be in a much better shape. But what I'm worried is going to happen is that the people that people will feel angry at will almost invariably be their populist political enemies. It would be the members of the public who, while they might disagree on some stuff, frankly have a lot more underlying agreement than they're willing to admit or willing to even consider. Maram, do you see where I'm going there? What's your take on that?
I see what you're saying. And I think what you're essentially alluding to is like Antifa and Proud Boys are going to be pitted against each other, which like Antifa, I think, are irrecoverable in that sense because they're basically going to act as the counter because they're against free speech. That's the central point. The problem is that they're against free speech and therefore they're going to be used as the state's counter gang against any Trump supporter. And anyone who is a Republican or is a Trump supporter is going to be labeled a racist by them. They're going to attack them in the street. And the counter gang strategy is something that is used against insurgencies, basically. So they'll be like the attack dog of the state. And I agree with you that if the left and the right were to come together, the supposedly anti-establishment left would come together to support essentially it's the working class movement against the establishment, then they could achieve something. But ironically, the anti-establishment left is right in the pocket of the establishment. And the thing is that no matter what you think these people's views are, obviously they're angry. They're angry about something. And the establishment isn't really heeding their concerns. Even if Trump didn't actually do anything that he promised, these people supported Trump because of his rhetoric, because of the populist talking points that he made. And that's what gave them, that's what drove them forward. But I think that, unfortunately, they're not listening to their demands. They don't want to hear why they're upset. And I also think, unfortunately, that Trump used these people because he basically wanted to pressure Pence into not committing to the Biden win in the election. And he brought these people to Capitol Hill, told them that he'd march with them into Capitol Hill, and in order to pressure Pence, he even said it. He even said it in his speech. Let's give these politicians the backbone to do the right thing by marching onto Capitol. And then he left. He then, when it came to the part where, the most dangerous part, the storm, he wasn't anywhere to be seen. And so now he's condemned his own supporters to save his own neck. And it kind of makes me feel that it's really unfair because now all those people are getting rounded up. Because if this was an insurrection, then it was a failed insurrection so far, and therefore the state's going to crack down hard on them. And I hear okay, I'll let you speak and take a breath. But I would love to talk about this Pied Piper thing because I don't exactly think that they're saying that Trump there was a Pied Piper strategy, and he's this is all staged, and he's done this on purpose to lead his followers into defeat.
No, I don't buy that.
And I have opinions on that. I don't buy that.
Yeah, I don't buy that either.
I agree with you.
But I want to get into the Antifa thing for a second before we get into the Pied Piper thing.
Sure.
Antifa is not the attack wing of the state. I mean, if you remember, the state under Donald Trump was attacking Antifa, calling these guys terrorists. Joe Biden is now going to come in and flip the domestic terrorism thing to basically the people who are, I suppose, rummaging the thing. I guess I'm making the point that Antifa is not against free speech. They're not attack dogs of the state. It's very specific, anti-fascist.
I would counter that.
Well, they're anti-fascist.
Because wait, 1 second. I used to roll in. Sorry, go on.
1 second.
I know what you're going to say. Go on. Sorry.
If I am arguing that free speech allows me to attack Jews, or free speech allows me to attack blacks and call them all sorts of names and everything else, yes, technically you could say that's free speech. But by the same token, that free speech is undermining my ability to be in a society where I am not, let's say, made extremely uncomfortable with the history of violence in the way that people have said things and gone through with those threats and gone through with those actions. I don't necessarily think anti-fascists just being against, let's say, Nazis or against what they consider to be people who are violent towards either other races or other identities as being against free speech. I can agree with you that sometimes it may go too far. Fair enough. But let's be clear that the intention behind it is not to be against free speech. And sometimes right-wingers have a tendency to argue free speech when they're saying things that are just ghastly. So, but you get the difference between those things, right? That there could be a subjective edge to it, but the basis of Antifa is not to be against free speech. Well, let me do this. Let's take a break. Let me bring you back, and I will let you get a full-throated response because we're at the 15-minute, and then we can go into the Pied Piper conversation. The voice that you guys are listening to is Maram Sousley, political commentator and geopolitical analyst. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Maram Sousley, political commentator and geopolitical analyst. Maram, before I ended this, I kind of made a point about Antifa, that I was pointing out that at one point, Antifa, under Donald Trump, was basically being called terrorists and were basically being attacked by the state. And so the idea that these guys are attack dogs of the state, I don't necessarily entirely buy that. From the standpoint of them anti-fascists being anti-speech, I guess it depends on what kind of speech you're talking about. If an individual is, let's say, given a hate speech, where they're talking about violence and threats and whatnot, that is free speech by definition, but is that really the kind of speech that your society wants? And if Antifa is against that, I think it's unfair to basically say they're an anti-free speech organization. But I'm going to let you respond.
I respect your position. I understand why your experience might be different to mine. But if I may be perfectly honest, when I was a young teenage activist, I used to roll in those circles. Okay, I used to know Antifa. And specifically, Antifa told me that the only way to fight, the best way to fight racist ideas is to beat it out of people. And so the entire, Antifa is not, look, I know Antifa, look, I know them, and they exist to commit violence against people who don't say things that they don't like. Now, if you, maybe those things are terrible, but the fact of the matter is they exist to enact violence against those people. But the thing is, Antifa is not just anti-fascism. Antifa is a ideological group that is tied to World War II. Like the first Antifa was created by the Communist Party of Germany in the 1930s, and it was specifically the military wing of the Communist Party. So there is a history of militarization amongst the Antifa, And that's why they always come out and oppose any right-wing position. And I'm not saying that I agree with the right-wing position, but what I will say is that they are terrorists because at least in Syria they are. Because Antifa did go into Syria and commit terrorist acts.
Well, explain that. Because the first time you said that, I didn't quite. The first time you said that, my thought was, what is she talking about? So explain that part where you made the point about Antifa being in Syria. I mean, are these Syrians? Are these what is the point, or what is the group? What is the responsibility of Antifa in Syria? Explain that. That was the first time I really had heard that part. Ram?
Oh, sorry. Hello. I hit the mute button.
Oh, there you are. We
so,
run into that problem too. So that's we run into that too.
So basically, the Kurdish groups that are fighting alongside the United States, that are collaborating with the occupation of the United States in Syria, are anarcho-Marxist. Okay, they follow the anarcho-Marxist ideology of a man named Mari Bookchin. And he wrote a book that Antifa also use as their ideological, cornerstone, which is the ecology of freedom. That is the name of the book. And Mari Bookchin is their ideological hero, and they essentially Antifa from the U.S., from Europe, from all over the world went in to Syria. Some of them are still there. To fight alongside the YPG and the PKK, the Kurdish militias, which the PKK, even the U.S. and Syria has already declared a terrorist organization, but the U.S. works with them, which is the war machine. It declares people terrorists and it works with them the next day, right? So in that sense, in the sense that they were declared a terrorist organization, and they're basically foreign fighters that are entering Syria and collaborating with the occupation. In that sense, they are terrorists. Now, am I talking about the average teenager who joins an Antifa movement off their college campus? Am I saying that those people are terrorists? No, not necessarily. Unless they start blowing up civilians somewhere, I'm not going to go that far. But there is an element there of there's a reason why people were declaring them terrorists, because not only do they espouse the ideas of, we want to be anti-fascist, specifically ideologically, they don't believe in borders. I know that there's this pull, anyone who's anti-fascist is Antifa. That's really not the case. But yes, I agree with you. I think that Trump used right-wing militias as counter-gang against Antifa. But Antifa is going to be used as a counter-gang against Biden's militia. And when I say counter-gang, I'm talking about when the state tries to protect itself, it tries to pit the people against each other. So what they're going to try to do is use the fact. So even police use this as a strategy to break up protests. They, instead of becoming the target themselves, they get the two sides. They pull back. They get the two sides to fight each other, and suddenly you have both sides coming to the police, asking them to arrest the other side. So that's going to be what I think, Shanahan was alluding to, of the people are not going to come together to try to overthrow the establishment. They can't see eye to eye. They can't see that they have actually common goals. But the establishment, I think that they are really now in a really terrible situation because they rely on the existence of the Republican Party to maintain a facade of a democracy that doesn't actually exist. And the fact that Trump had the most votes of any Republican leader in history, now it's going to be very, very difficult to paint his supporters as a fringe group. And it's going to be difficult to rebrand the Republican Party. And I think what we said about the Pied Piper strategy, I don't think that this is all a stage. I don't think Trump did this in order to get people arrested and, in order to enact new laws that oppose free speech and crack down on dissent, because I don't think the state wants to enact these laws to crack down. I think they have to crack down. They have no choice anymore. If they could maintain power by not cracking down and maintaining a facade of democracy, they would. But now at this point, people have had enough.
Very interesting point, and I agree with you. And I just want to, come back to the idea of the Pied Piper strategy that you're talking about here. That would be Trump intentionally leading his supporters astray. It seems to me that he simply became a coward at a certain point. He
yes.
said these things. He amped up his rhetoric. His family, his lawyer on the day of the event, calling for, admittedly, rhetorically calling for violence, and the kind of violence that Giuliani was calling for, again, admittedly, was legal violence, but that doesn't deny the fact that the day of, he was calling for trial by combat just hours before his supporters marched on Congress. So in that sense, Trump and his team incited this, and then literally the next day, Trump turned his back on his team, condemning them after the day before he had said that he loved them. Now that seems, admittedly, pretty Trumpian, in that Trump, if you look at how he's treated officials in his administration, again, there are other reasons for this, but he brings people in, he gets along perfectly well with them on the surface, and then very quickly he turns on them, he outs them, and after he outs them, he insults them, and that is the trend. And again, many of these people may be worth insulting, but that's just how he operates. With this idea, you're talking about the Republican Party not being able to get away from the MAGA movement. How completely they have come to have to represent Trump's base. Trump's base has largely become their base. Never Trumpers are kind of a rounding error in the mass of the Republican Party. It seems to me like that's just going to hurt the Republicans in years to come, because I agree with you completely. But after last Wednesday's events, I don't see how the Republican Party in 2024, maybe even 2028, it's going to take a lot of work for them to create distance between themselves, between their base, and this event. What's your take on that, Maram? Where do you think this is going to go?
You're right. And the fact is that banks are stopping donations to the Republican Party. Different corporations are cutting off specific individuals that are part of the Republican Party. People are becoming persona non grata. They're putting people on no-fly lists. They're firing people who attended the rally that the president of the United States told them to attend. And that, I think, is just going to make people angrier. And when it comes to the banks, the Citibank stopping donations to the Republican Party candidates based on whether or not they supported Trump, that, to me, that's kind of funny, because that means they're not buying the politician anymore, which means that politician now has the freedom to represent what the people want rather than what Citibank wants. But they're not going to be able to. They want to bring the Republicans back into the standard form of government that has perpetuated in the U.S., which is really just one party with very little variation. And I think the problem is that people began to realize that there isn't enough difference between Republicans and Democrats. And Trump, even though all evidence to the contrary, based on what he did, with what he said, it seemed on the outside that he was different, even though he really wasn't. And that's what people held on to, is the ideas that Trump espoused. And that's going to be harder to get rid of than the belief in Trump himself.
Miranda.
So I don't see how they can go on. Sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm sorry. I thought there was a pause. I thought you were finishing the statement. I was just going to say, I think you're right. You I really do believe I think that's where the crux of it is. I think the Republicans, whatever you want to think of the people who rated, they get that something's wrong. And they fundamentally disagree with the standard Republican stuff. And so you get this kind of breaking between the two, where you have the Romneys of the world that are the standard for the standard Republican Party, whereas you have the Trumps of the world that is, I guess you can say, the populists, if you want to call it that, the faux populists.
Yes.
On the other side...
And many of them are anti-war,
Right there, anti-war, right. And on the other side, for Democrats, you have something similar. I mean, you have this kind of fighting between the two wings, but in this case, you have, whereas it seems like the populists were able to win on the Republican side, it seems that the populists weren't able to win on the Democrat side. How weird.
Yes.
How weird. What do you think this ends up within, let's say, a year? You have about 30 seconds.
I think that there's going to be local militias. I think maybe local militias will take over government locations. There might be a push for Texas to secede. I think that the government, the state apparatus, the FBI, the NSA, all of the alphabet groups and Silicon Valley is going to crack down on dissidents harder than any so-called totalitarian state that exists outside of the U.S. And I think the sham of a democracy is going to be exposed internationally, and it's going to be dangerous. The whole thing's going to be really dangerous.
Thank you, Maram. Maram Suzley, political commentator and geopolitical analyst. That is the voice you guys have been listening to. You can follow Maram on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl, and find her on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan, and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines. Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Jane Stranahan.
And that means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 2,048 new coronavirus deaths and 222,900 new cases were reported in the United States on January 11th. Over the past week, there's been an average of 250,721 cases per day, an increase of 37% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Tuesday morning, more than 22,673,700 people in the United States have been affected with coronavirus, and more than 376,000 have died from it. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa extended coronavirus restrictions in the country Monday, citing a, quote, massive increase, unquote, in COVID-19 cases driven by a variant discovered there last year. The current measures were due to expire on January 15th and include closing beaches and public parks and banning the sale of alcohol. In addition to extending the existing measures, Ramaphosa announced that 20 land borders will be closed until February 15th. Malaysian king declared a nationwide state of emergency today to curb the spread of COVID-19, a move that bolsters Prime Minister Yassin's hold on power and forestalls any attempt by opponents to force an early election. Prime Minister Yassin said the parliament will be suspended for a period of time and that elections will not be held during the emergency, which could last until August 1st. How convenient. Disneyland Resort in Anaheim will soon be transformed into a mass coronavirus vaccination site for the Southern California residents, Orange County officials announced on Monday. Excellent. Indiana is the latest state to report its first case of the more contagious COVID-19 variant first identified in the United Kingdom, bumping the total states that have identified the strain to 10. Shane, speaking on the COVID stuff and the restrictions and whatnot, at this point, it seems that we're in the worst of both worlds. We've done the shutdowns. We've done the shutdowns without ensuring that the businesses were made whole during the shutdowns. And on top of that, we've spiraled further than any other country in regards to how bad we've handled the COVID-19 issue. So now, what do? At this point, I mean, I know they're thinking about the vaccinations as being kind of a way out of this. They're hoping it's a way out of this. But ultimately, we've tried the lockdowns, and we've, I guess you could say, have been locked down for like a year now, and the virus is out of control. Now what?
You're actually asking that question. Oh man.
Yeah.
So here's a quick addition. You say at this point, we've been there since like March, man. And I'm not, I mean, admittedly, the death toll has risen. Things have gotten worse since then. I'm not trying to downplay that aspect.
But now there's also another variant. And like, I guess we're making the point that it's like we've done, it's like, where do we go from here? It's like I don't know where's the out. Like, it just seems like at this point, you almost just have to take the punch in the face. I don't know what else to do at this point.
Through death and continued lockdowns. Yeah, I mean, it's that bad. There is no way out at this point. The best, an ounce of, a gram of prevention would have been worth a pound of cure in this case. Not even an ounce. If we had, and I don't want to. I mean, here's the thing: if we had locked down, not just locked down, but if we had shut down all borders back in February or March, if every country around the world had quote unquote over-responded, which is what it would have been considered, because we wouldn't have seen the crisis emerging at that point. That wouldn't have been politically feasible. But again, it would have been considered an over-response. And if you remember, back in January, February, this was like a marginal concern for most folks back when this was first spreading. So there was no real cause. I'm trying to go back to the sort of inciting set of events here. There was no apparent cause for various federal officials in the United States and for, governmental officials around the world to lock down so stringently, despite what they saw happening in China, because in their eyes, they didn't know what was going on. They thought it was going to be a sort of self-contained outbreak, like SARS was for the most part, like MERS was for the most part. But no, this thing is worse than either of those in terms of its death toll overall. And yeah, we could have responded more appropriately back then, and that would have made a huge difference. But we didn't. I don't see how we could have. We could have prepared for it over the course of years, and that would have helped significantly early on. But no, there's no way out of this at this point, man. Especially again with this new strain spreading, I would not underestimate how potent that's going to be in 2 to 5 months. And that's admittedly a pretty broad range there, but going throughout the whole of spring and going into early summer, if the numbers are right, if this thing is, call it 50% on average more infectious, could be up to 70%, could be as low as 30%, but that seems to be a pretty solid range, then it's going to be getting dramatically worse pretty quickly here. Yeah, there's no way out of that, Jamarl, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Because you're right. I mean, our decision space is being constrained. At this point, we're at the let's say a bunch of bad choices. Now it's like, all right, now that we made 20 bad choices, let's try to make a good one. And let's try to make that good one count. Yeah, it doesn't work that way. Reality doesn't give us outs when you get down to a bad spot. 2 Democratic Congresswomen, Representative Pramil Jayapal of the Seattle area and Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, 75 of New Jersey, have both tested positive for COVID-19 after sheltering in place with fellow lawmakers during the attack on the U.S. Capitol last week. This is an additional consequence. There's an irony there that Jayapal is the woman who basically wrote Medicare for All in the House and is now infected with COVID-19. Hint, Jayapal. Medicare for all, hint, take the hint that God and the cosmos is giving you to push for this policy. President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence spoke Monday evening in the Oval Office, their first meeting since the assault on the U.S. Capitol last week. House Republicans, meanwhile, blocked a resolution from Democratic Representative Jamie Raskin to call on Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove the president from office. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said the House will vote today and can proceed with impeachment if Pence doesn't act. Now, I know a lot of lefties don't necessarily agree with Pelosi, and they don't particularly like Pelosi. I'm not a big fan of Pelosi either. I was one of those people that basically said anybody other than Pelosi would have been perfectly okay just from this issue of, you don't pass Medicare for all. You pass Trump's bills, and you cut the amount that you were going to give the people to $900 billion after telling them that $1.8 trillion is insufficient. Maybe Pelosi shouldn't get her seat. That's where I was, so fair enough. But removing myself from this, from the standpoint of Dog in the Hunt, and you're looking at this as just political actors fighting one another or political forces, I have a hard time seeing how Pelosi is wrong. At the end of the day, the President of the United States broke the rules. Those rules being, if you lose, You say, I'm sorry, I lost, I suck, and you go home and you concede. Those are the rules. It's very taboo for a president to dance around this idea that he didn't lose the election and to foment a mob to descend upon the Capitol. That's a big deal. And Pelosi, from a political standpoint, is not wrong for extracting consequences from this. Whether it's telling Pence, hey, either you invoke the 25th Amendment or I, Pelosi, within the context of my powers, is going to have him removed from the standpoint of impeachment. And on the secondary point of that, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, where you're actually going after members in Congress that backed the president on this issue. Yeah, we're not playing anymore from the standpoint of the political space. And this is just the beginning. This doesn't even count the attacks that are going to take place. Like I said, Joe Biden talking about revising the rules for domestic terrorism as if there aren't enough rules for domestic terrorism as is. Yeah, there will be a pushback on this. No doubt. This is just the beginning. Yesterday, U.S. President-elect Joe Biden announced William Burns as his pick to lead the CIA. Burns is a former ambassador to Russia and Jordan who helped lead the secret talks with Iran. Burns, in partnership with Biden's nominee for Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, will likely be tasked with rebuilding the U.S. spies community reputation. Shane, looking at this, not cynically for the moment, but just looking at this, I always make the argument that people are policy. When Donald Trump brought in Abrams to be the person who oversees Venezuela, Abrams was the guy who was in charge of the kill squads and got basically convicted for lying to Congress on a lot of the stuff. So it gave you a clear idea on where Trump was going to go with Venezuela. In this case, if Joe Biden is putting in Burns, who apparently led the secret talks with Iran in order to get the deal done, does this mean that Joe Biden is trying to rebuild his relationship with Iran if people indeed are policy by putting Burns into the spot? I mean, is this potentially a good thing? Iran made the point of saying basically, hey, we're going to get back to the deal. They were very confident. Rouhani was very confident that they would be able to negotiate and get back to the Iran deal with Joe Biden, even though Joe Biden didn't seem that confident when he was talking about it during the campaign. Is Burns an indication that that's where Joe Biden is headed?
I mean, if from Joe Biden's perspective, I genuinely don't know. I'm not sure. From Iran's perspective, do you really think they would be willing to do that at this point? Admittedly, 2020 was under a Trump administration, so and effectively a Mike Pompeo administration over in the State Department. But between the assassination of Soleimani early in the year and the follow-on assassinations later in the year, do you think they would be willing to go along with that? Or as we've said with our guests, Rouhani, a moderate leader of Iran, is he potentially on the outs and potentially a more hardline sort of anti-American, figure coming in? What's your take, Jamarl?
I suspect a hardliner will come in. I mean, like you said, the assassinations taints the relationship. The pulling out of the agreement taints the relationship. Iran had to take all sorts of concessions in order to get the deal, meaning that nuclear deal was all sorts of invasions of sovereignty. But they accepted it because their thought was, if they're going to remove the sanctions, we can get our economy up and running. We're not trying to get nuclear weapons anyway, so let's go with it. And then to come out and have Trump pull out of it, and then on top of pulling out of it, attack the various people, kill various people in assassinations attempts? I don't know. I mean, it depends how they look at it. They could look at it and say, look, it's more important to get the economy running, so we have to just kind of take it. But you could also look at it as we're a sovereign nation, and like any other sovereign nation that's attacked, we have a natural right to respond. I have no idea. I mean, the politics of Iran, they've been very clever and very calculated, and I mean that in the positive, in the way that they've negotiated the politics of this. They didn't put themselves in a situation of getting involved in a higher war, even though they definitely got across that they were pushing back in a kind of tit-for-tat way. It was this kind of asymmetric warfare. So I don't know. I don't know if this is going to be one thing overt while something else is going on behind the scenes. It is unclear to me. And so I don't know. It's possible that Trump and Israel got what they wanted in tainting this relationship so much that regardless of who came in, it was impossible to fix it. So we'll see. I mean, this is going to be one of the interesting things that happens. I'm just curious on whether Burns is kind of a nod that there may be a difference and policy tone between Trump and Biden. We'll see. I mean, that's, future will tell, I suppose. Former Republican Congressman Ron Paul says he's been blocked by Facebook from managing his account over repeated violations of the social media giant's community standards, with no explanation other than, quote, repeatedly going against our community standards, unquote. Facebook has blocked me from managing my page. Never have we received notice of violating community standards in the past, and nowhere is the offending post identified, Paul wrote on Twitter on Monday. The column Paul posted Monday to his Facebook page was about tech censorship. They censored me when I was talking about tech censorship. Let's keep going. I want to talk about that when we get the chance, but that's a big deal. Today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu changed his cover photo in Twitter, which was a joint photo of himself sitting next to Trump at a White House meeting, and is now a picture of Netanyahu receiving the vaccine with the phrase, "Citizens of Israel, we are returning to life." The head of Egypt's Civil Aviation Authority, Ashraf Noyer, announced on Tuesday that Cairo has resumed air services with Qatar and lifted the air embargo imposed on flights of Qatar Airlines to the North African country following the 3-year freeze. In 2017, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt cut diplomatic ties with Qatar, accusing it of meddling and sponsoring terrorism. Several other countries later did the same thing, while others downgraded their diplomatic ties with Doha and introduced a total blockade of the country. Doha has consistently denied the accusations, insisting that the neighbors' discontent with its economic success was behind their hostile policies. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There are a few more of these headlines that I want to get to when we get the opportunity, but that's a fascinating one. I was in Qatar when this was taking place, my wife and I had the opportunity to speak to one of the cab drivers about the blockade, his feelings about it, what he thought this was about, and everything else. This was a fascinating event to take place, and like the article says, it's been taking place over the last 3 years. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip. We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil. John Gaunt. Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, that is 202-521-1320. Jamarl, one other quick thing I want to add in here. I've actually met this dude. He was sanctioned on 2 days ago, on Sunday, sanctioned by the U.S. government. Secretary of State Pompeo wrote this out. I'm going to read from this. Pompeo is sanctioning a, quote, Russia-linked foreign influence network associated with Andrei Derkach, end quote. Among those sanctioned include, quote, Konstantin Kulik, Alexander Onyshenko, Andrei Telezhenko, and current member of the Ukrainian parliament, Alexander Dubinsky, end quote. I've actually met the third one who is mentioned there as a sort of, attendance or whatever, Andrei Telezhenko. I've met this guy. Good guy, as far as I can tell. And just throwing that in there. We got a bunch of other headlines that we're going to get through. And it's a little bit hard to tie this in. But I met him. It's not a Russia-linked disinformation network. The United States continuing to sanction a bunch of individuals, again, as part of the Magnitsky Act, what that process allows us to do. So just throwing that into the pot. If you've been following this story, Andrei Telizhenko was a whistleblower in the Ukrainian embassy. Back is relates to Alexandra Chalupa back in 2016. What was going on there? Where effectively the DNC and the Ukrainian government were working together.
Right. To get information
among other things.
Or Manafort, basically.
Yeah, exactly. On Manafort specifically, among other things, to try to get information on Manafort, who was then the campaign chair for Trump's campaign.
And by the way, this came out in Politico. This was reported in multiple sources. And then immediately after the election, they tried to act as if, no, there's nothing to see here, folks. They didn't do that. It's like, get out of here. Get out of here. It's like the DNC, look, either it was magic that it just so happened that Chalupa was working, with the Ukrainian embassy, and just so happened they released information on Manafort. It just so happened that stuff was against the law. Like, come on. Like, the courts have shown that that Ukraine interceded in our elections. But at that point, there was this weird cover-up where they tried to act like the story wasn't legit. Do you remember this? Like, immediately after this happened and after this came out and this was reported and everything else, there was this kind of backlash of a cover-up of sorts of trying to say, no, there's nothing to see here. The Ukraine wasn't given information on Manafort, et cetera, et cetera. I think they tried to act like Solomon. They tried to act like Solomon was a hack or Solomon was lying about the story.
Yeah, and I know literally I will put it like this. Just real quick, just to throw this out there, the original Politico article that kicked a lot of this stuff off was written by Ken Vogel and David Stern over at Politico. The title of the article is Ukrainian Efforts to Sabotage Trump Backfire. That was published January 11th, 2017. So not during the actual election cycle. It was published after Trump had won. And in that article, great overview of the story. It sort of set a lot of this stuff off. They lay out the case for what happened here. And in its own way, this is a bombshell that sort of silently went off because it wasn't reported for a long time. Eventually, John Solomon over at The Hill started to report on this. But I will add this, and this is kind of what I was getting to. He didn't do a very good job of it, to be honest. I've literally read articles that he drafted but did not publish that would have had relevant, true, and useful information that he did not publish. I'm guessing out of fear, but I don't like to guess about this kind of thing. So I'll stop there. But yeah, he didn't publish some stuff. So he did some work on it, but it was incomplete. And again, he didn't do, in my opinion, his sort of journalistic fiduciary duty as a relationship, as a party relating to the public. He didn't do his duty by actually publishing what he had on this story. Anyway, I'm just throwing that in there. They shouldn't have pardoned Telizhenko. It's ridiculous. Particularly, I know so much about the story through my dad, and he's kind of been sending me stuff because he talks to Telizhenko sometimes. But yeah, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous what happened here. Anyway, we are taking calls 202-521-1320.
Wait. 1320. Which one is Telizhenko? The names. Sometimes the names throw me. It's like I know the positions and I know what some of the people did, but I don't know. The names always throw me. Which one is Telizhenko?
Andrei Telizhenko is a whistleblower who is working with the Ukrainian embassies. And, he is a Ukrainian. Right. He's working with the embassy while this stuff was going on. And he did not like some of what they were asking him to do. It seemed corrupt. We have Lee calling in.
Lee I remember. This is the gentleman who basically kind of made the point about saying that they were trying to get information released through, one of the agencies that Joe Biden started, that the Biden administration was working with. Because Biden at this point was like a viceroy within Ukraine. You know this story far better than I do, the intricacies of it. But Telizhenko, was he the one who basically, like you say, he blew the whistle, but he was the one that was basically telling about the agencies, basically talking about what they were asking him to do in getting information against Trump, basically, for the election itself, the interference.
Let's get Lee on. We've got Lee calling in, my dad.
Oh, excellent.
occasional guest on this show, right? Calling in right now. Lee, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning? What's going on?
Good. The main reason I was calling you guys, I can talk about the Andrei Telizhenko thing if you want me to, but is that there's breaking news just breaking that Sheldon Adelson is dead. And this is very significant for a lot of reasons because he's obviously one of the main funders of the GOP, but also because he funded the spy operation on Julian Assange. And so that's breaking news. That's the main reason I called in was to tell you guys that. But I can talk about the Andre thing if you want me to.
That's huge. Thank you for the call. Huge. That's coming out last 15 to 20 minutes. Also, if I remembering correctly, isn't he a board member on Genie Energy? But I might be wrong about that. But Lee,
Adelson is not a board member of Genie Energy. No.
Thank you. I got that right.
Netanyahu, but he's not on the board. No.
Wow, that's big. I mean, Adelson has been a financial donor for politics for God knows how long, and put millions, like the amount of money that he dropped into political campaigns. So I would imagine a lot of Republicans are very concerned at this moment that he has passed. That's big news. That is big news. How old is Adelson, by the way, Lee? He had to be like 80 something.
I believe he was 87. I believe that's the number I heard, but it could be. I'm going from memory on that. I believe he's 87.
Wow, that's amazing. All right.
And with coming back to Andrei Telizhenko for a second, I'm guessing you heard some of what we were talking about there. Is there anything you'd like to add on to that? Since of course, you are the guy on this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, this is very significant. It was 4 years ago today that an article came out in Politico. It was literally 4 years ago today that an article came out in Politico that was very well reported that talked about how a DNC official had gone to the Ukrainian embassy and was interfering in the election on behalf of the Hillary Clinton campaign. Now, I have, parenthetically, I have new information on this, some of which Shane has seen. So when I say this, Shane will be able to go, or you can disagree. But I have new proof that's come out that is absolutely rock solid, that actually this DNC collusion with the Ukraine goes back even further than I knew or had reported. So Shane, you've seen some of this stuff and you know what I'm talking about.
Wait, just so we know the basic story though, just so the audience understands the basic format. Basically, Chalupa goes to the Ukrainian embassy and talking to the Ukrainian embassy basically works with the embassy to get information or Ukraine to release information on Manafort. They do that, and that information gets Manafort basically arrested.
No, on Manafort and Trump. And this was in March, April of 2016. This is in March or April. So this is months before the Washington Post story in June broke about the supposed hack. This operation by the DNC, I've been reporting, and this Political article pointed out for 4 years now, that this operation by the DNC working with the Ukrainian government is very old. It was not started on election night. Russiagate was not started even with the supposed hack. It was started months earlier. And again, I have new information coming out very soon that proves this beyond a shadow of a doubt. So, Andre, what's significant about this is that this is the Trump administration yesterday, Mnuchin and Pompeo, covering up the Ukrainian interference in the election. And what they're doing is they're saying that Andrei Telizhenko is part of a Russian disinformation campaign. Now, Shane knows Andrei a little bit, and I know Andrei very well. He doesn't like Russia. Andrei's Ukrainian. He doesn't like Russia. He's from that part of Ukraine that doesn't like Russia. And so he has never been on my show. He wouldn't come on because it's on Sputnik. And so this idea that he's being sanctioned for being part of a Russian disinformation campaign by Trump officials, I'll say that again, by Trump officials, to cover up the story of Joe Biden's interference in Ukraine, the U.S. government's interference in Ukraine, and how that played into the election in 2016 is stunning. And I can tell you...
Wait, why would they do that? That is stunning. I mean, what would be their motivation to do something like that? I mean, basically, they would be covering up that the Biden administration or the Obama administration basically attacked, or I'm saying this wrong, basically that the DNC used their ends with the Ukrainian government to basically attack Trump as he tried to run into the race. Why would they try to cover that up? That's somewhat of a big deal. I thought that was a bombshell when the Political article came out. When I first read that, I was like, whoa, here's the foreign interference that they were looking for. So why would they hide that?
Bombshell. And the reason they've covered it up is that Republicans as well as Democrats, this is a anti-Russia operation. And this is about stealing Russia's oil and energy assets and other assets from the 1990s. And that's why you had Bill Browder, for instance, who we've talked about many times. That's why Bill Browder is a hero of Fox News. Fox News promotes Browder. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are in on this anti-Russia narrative. And it's not about human rights. It's not about anything except money. It's about literally stealing Yukos and Gazprom and all these other companies. And they're all in on it. In fact, some of the other stuff I'm going to be reporting in the next couple of weeks is how Chuck Grassley was absolutely part of this operation to cover this up. And you can see this going back to September when they issued sanctions and Grassley was making statements against a guy named Derkach. He's a member of parliament in Ukraine. And he's the guy who released the audio of Biden talking to Poroshenko. Now, no one's denying that audio is real. And it's significant because it shows there was a quid pro quo. And yet, Chuck Grassley, head of the Senate committee investigating this, said it was Russian disinformation. So, I mean, if you just think about that, it's stunning. How is something that's true and a phone call Russian disinformation? But when it comes to this, the Democrats and Republicans and all the people I've been talking about on, here on Sputnik and previously even when I was at Breitbart, they're all in on it. They are all in on it. And by the way, provably all in on it. Because why would they cover up?
Lee, we only have actually, we probably don't even have 30 seconds. But I am curious about one thing. Why didn't Trump do anything to expose this stuff while he was in office? All of his supporters wanted it. Even people on the left wanted him to do it. And he had the power to do it. He was in the position. And he was surrounded by people, I would hope, that at some level wanted to back him up. Why didn't he ever do this? He had the opportunity. He never took it.
Because he wasn't surrounded by people who wanted to back him. And I'll just leave you with this. Andrei Telezenko was never allowed to talk to Donald Trump. So let me just put it there. Andrei could have blown the whole thing up. He was never allowed to talk to Donald Trump.
Lee, thank you for calling. And just one quick note, Derkach, the figure we were just mentioning, the Ukrainian politician, again, he is the one sort of centered in this new set of sanctions. He is. I'm going to read from the sanction here. They're opposing sanctions on 7 individuals and 4 entities that are part of a Russian-linked foreign influence network associated with Andrei Derkach, quote unquote. So that's who they're choosing to target on this. Anyway, Lee, thank you for the call. He is the host, by the way, of The Backstory here on Radio Sputnik. We need to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute with Teddy Ficre, Teodos Ficre.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Teodos Ficre, co-founder and former editor of the GeonJournal.com. Teodos, welcome back to the show, man. How's it going?
Good morning, Jamal and Shane. How's everything on your end?
So far, so good. We're trying to keep safe, bunkered down, but can't complain. So
yeah, these days it's getting harder and harder to do that.
It is, right? It is harder to bunker down. What did you think of the raid on the Capitol the other day? I mean, you pay attention to politics, and like I said before, I've always enjoyed your articles, especially you've always had a introspection that was honest in regards to your understanding of self or your exploration of self that I've always appreciated.
Right.
And I don't, you don't always see that. You always see, sometimes you see posturing and this other stuff. And I thought you always tried to be honest, regardless of where the opinion went. So how do you view basically a large number of white men raiding the Capitol and being allowed to do so by some of the police and some of the military that apparently were there that basically allowed it to take place? And now there's this kind of backlash from all of it. How do you process all of this?
A lot to unpack there. So first and foremost, I always want to depend on my own eyes and my own ears to form an opinion or to form a thought on things. So I made it a point to go down to the Washington Monument on the day before, or Tuesday, January the 5th, and the day of, on Wednesday, January the 6th, to kind of just be amongst the masses. And, one would think that if you go down to that crowd, you would see a bunch of lynching symbolism, a bunch of, racists that were just ready to pounce on anyone of my complexion. And the truth could not be anything more opposite than that. Everyone that I met was actually very friendly. And I wrote about this, an article the following day called The Rebels Yell in D.C. And most of them were God-fearing. Most of them were completely friendly and welcoming. This is not what you would get if you watch this on CNN or MSNBC. Not once did I encounter anyone that had a hint of racism about them. And I interviewed actually over, I think, about 6 or 7 people, a couple that were I broadcasted live at the Guion Journal page. So there's the propaganda of CNN and MSNBC and the reality of what actually took place. So now, with respect to them storming the U.S. Capitol and being called a mob and insurrectionist, what a bunch of baloney. First and foremost, the U.S. Capitol is supposed to be the people's house, right? So when people go in there and demand an audience with their representatives and their senators, that's not an invasion. That's people reclaiming that which they paid for with their tax dollars. Now, nobody.
I don't buy that. I don't buy this, and I want to respond. Then I want to, of course, give you a chance to respond. But if for one thing, they weren't just showing up demanding an audience. People were there. Some of them to lynch the vice president and members of Congress. It seems like death was on their minds, as far as I can tell. Like Jamarl has said, people were showing up with zip ties and other implements to bind people.
And pipe bombs. That's and pipe bombs.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, and some explosives too. So I'm not saying that the entire crowd are like domestic terrorists. I would call them a mob though, and I would call them insurrectionaries. I don't know how you can get around that. And many of the folks who were there were not just talking about seeking an audience with members of Congress. They're talking about a revolution. I mean, you can see plenty of footage of people talking about this.
When did a revolution become a bad thing? Like, it's our constitutional right as Americans. Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human history, when their government ceases to be governed or ceases to govern through consent, and they instead govern through duplicity, and they start working against our active collective interest. Now, we as Americans have a right to rebel. We are a country that was born through the womb of a revolution.
That's true.
Insurrection.
Do you think that we do have a right to rebel? Do you think that most people?
I was just going to say, yes, a right to rebel. But what was taking place was based on this premise that Donald Trump was being cheated out of an election that Donald Trump basically lost. Right. And these guys were there. They weren't there with this idea of, hey, we're going to, fight for the people's health care. We're going to fight for people's education. That wasn't on the agenda. The agenda was we're going to stop Congress from certifying the election results. That's what they were there for.
Well, I don't agree with that premise. I mean, there's a bunch of useful idiots. So
how can you not agree with it? Donald Trump and the people who were there were literally there with the idea that they were being cheated, and that these that was the majority opinion. That was the entire point of the protest.
No, what I'm saying is I don't agree with that line of thinking of theirs. I mean, you know what I'm saying? When I say useful idiots, I'm saying that there was a bunch of useful idiots of Trump that weren't there under this premise that Donald Trump was cheated, and they think that Donald Trump is the next great savior. And so look, idiocy is bipartisan. People that did that, they are the sheep that they are. But just because I don't agree with their premise does not mean I discount their actions in entirety. I still agree with what they did. I wish we did that. I wish we actually. I know the analogy is, oh my God, had black folks done this, we've been shot, and most likely that's true. But maybe if we'd have joined the forces and said, well, you know what, I don't care what your cause is. I care with the underlying reason why you're doing this. And if the underlying reason is that you are rebelling against authority, then I'm with you. You know what I'm saying? Put aside our color differences, put aside our political differences. If you are rebelling against that government entity that is actively working against my interests, then I'm with you. So again, this idea.
I'll put it like this: I wouldn't want to live in a revolutionary government imposed by the crowd that was marching on Congress. I wouldn't want to live in a revolutionary government under any minority fringe political group that I see in the United States at this point. Some of them I agree with deeply on certain issues, but some of them have some crazy stuff to say, frankly. And the ones that I do agree with pretty much completely aren't nearly powerful enough to take control of that kind of thing. And then, I mean, that's right up one of the main issues. Another thing is, it just seems so damn impractical. And there are deeper problems with revolutions as a whole, with what they bring on the other side of them, how revolutions seem to bring an increased centralization of power, and how I'm worried that any revolutionary government, the day after the revolution, the week after it, the year, the decade, et cetera, all that's going to lead to is a more bloody and despotic regime on the other side. But then there's the fact that, again, even if it doesn't somehow magically, the vast majority of people, myself included, would not want to live in a revolutionary government imposed by the folks that marched on Congress. So when you say, we have a right to revolution, I mean, in some senses, yes, completely. But what does that mean? Does that just mean that any minority with the will and power to exert its control over the levers of government has a right to impose that on everybody who lives in this country? Because if we do, that does not match with my understanding of either what I want or what the founders wanted, or what, frankly, most sane human beings seem to want either.
Just for the record, I don't believe in revolutions either. I came to America in 1983 as a consequence of Ethiopia undergoing a revolution that deposed Haile Selassie and then led to the death of over 500,000 Ethiopians. So for the record, I'm anti-revolutionary in that way. I believe in evolutions, not revolutions. But I will say this, though. Should you not be more pissed off that the barest minority, the slimmest of minorities, which are billionaires and their lobbyists in D.C., are the ones that are actually determining our lives? Who are you pissed off at more? I'm
100% more pissed off. Just to respond, I'm 100% more pissed off at the elites, and that's pretty much what we talk about every day. I mean, we've covered this issue for the last less than a week because, of course, it's been happening. I condemn it, but we reserve the vast majority. I can speak for myself. I'm pretty sure Jamarl is included in this too, though. The vast majority of my animosity I levy against the elites who hold the real power. But I would argue that Trump is one of those elites, and that he was spurring his supporters to violence that in the end is just going to get them arrested, that got them killed, and for no good end.
I agree with you completely. Like I said, Trump is just another serpent. I call them all public serpents. He is an insider through and through. He's a grifter that saw an opportunity, and he's no different than Obama. He's just a complete different shade and a different complexion of Obama. Whereas Obama is articulate and emotionless, Trump knows how to get on people's connects on a visceral level, and he's He's I don't even know. He's an oaf that has almost zero command of the English language. But that doesn't mean that he's the same thing as Obama. He's yes we can and reverse. And so MAGA is no different than yes we can. Both political slogans meant to distract the people and divide us. So yeah, I go back to why are we not more pissed off that our Congress has been overtaken by the 1%, and why are we upset when the proletariat rise up? Whether or not you agree with their politics is inconsequential.
Well, I think Theodros, I think what you're trying to say, and I think the difference, if I could mind the gap for a moment, has to do with why they did it. If the reason was different, we'd be with you. I think the issue that we have is that their reasoning was utterly unhinged. Because ultimately, what's on the other end of that? Say they were successful. What's on the other end of that? The entire point that they were there were to overturn the election for Trump, and Trump pressuring Pence to basically do what Pence did not necessarily want to do and didn't even believe he had the power to do. They were trying to overturn the results of the election. So that's the thing that we're horrified by, because it's like what happens on day 2 of a revolution that starts like that. But I think if the reason was different, we'd be with you. Meaning, if that mob was, let's say, multiracial, and if that mob were there saying 400,000 people have died, this demands an audience. If they were there arguing that 20 million people have been infected by this illness, all of these businesses, 40%, have been shut down as a result of government action, basically shutting the businesses down without giving compensation. There's reasons. So the issue isn't, oddly enough, and I think that's the weird, maddening thing about this. It's not so much that I don't get why people would be upset, why people would be angry. There are a list of reasons that those people would be there in order to scream and shake their fist at their congressman. But the one reason that wasn't on that is that Donald Trump won. And that was the one reason they were there. And I think that's the issue that we have. That's the difference. It's like I get the anger, but I get the anger for a litany of other issues as opposed to the one reason that they were there. Does that make sense? And is that the difference? Whereas the context, if the context changed, then our opinion on this might be in agreement with yours, but the context is what it is. They were doing this for Trump. Does that make sense? Is that a way to mind the gap between the differences in the way I think we're talking about this?
By the way?
Well, let's do this. Let's take a break because we're at the 45-minute spot. So let's bring you back. Shane can bring you back, but I do want to give you a chance to respond because we've been having to go at you for a bit. So the voice that you guys have been hearing is Theodros Fikre, co-founder and former editor of theguionjournal.com. You can follow Theodros Fikre on Twitter at Theodros Fikre, and find his column on the Guion Journal or the Guion Journal. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Theodros Fikre. He is the co-founder and former editor of GuionJournal.com. You can follow Theodros on Twitter, also at Theodros Fikre, and of course you should find his column, The Guion Journal. Theodros, thank you for joining us. I wanted to continue this conversation. I'll put it like this. Jamarl, you're saying I would agree with you. I'm opposed to pretty much any violent revolution I've seen, and here's why. Invariably, what almost always seems to happen is that they are used to justify the increase of power by the state on the other side of the revolution. And I don't see how there would be an exception to that in the United States, even if there's a rosy period of a couple of years. And I don't want to get into a long drawn out thing. So of course we'll have time for that in this conversation. But even if there's a period of a couple of years where things seem like they're going okay, despite people getting killed or people, just the system as a whole being radically shaken up. On the other side of that, it seems like what always happens is the state grows more powerful, and that power is then captured and used by various new elites to oppress the vast majority of individuals within the country. Then the question is, what's the alternative? Peaceful reform, sure, that can sometimes do the trick. I think broadly focusing on creating new underlying technological and economic shifts that lead to new prevailing orders changes things much more radically at a much deeper level. It's admittedly harder too, but I wish that there were more people operating in that space from that mindset. If there were, hopefully we'd see some progress. But I just wanted to get that in there because
Well,
you were saying
we talked about it before. You agreed that you said if everything took place with the exception of, or with the difference being the reasoning, meaning healthcare, that you would have been more on board for something like that. Meaning, okay, that's fair. That may be a difference. You're saying it's just, not necessarily that it would end up being better. So that's fair. That's a fair distinction.
That's exactly what I was saying.
That's fair distinction.
That's exactly what I was saying. I was saying that they would have been more justified, and that I think that they would have even been justified. If your family member is dying and you see Congress giving you a pittance, giving you effectively nothing, while keeping you from getting a job, if they're putting you into a state of almost permanent economic despair, then yeah, I think you've got a lot more justification for that than you think that your team got cheated. Which admittedly, if you think that, that's still a crime. But I don't think there's nearly as much evidence for it. And I don't think that it's a crime on the same order and it's nearly as personal. Anyway, you were right in your characterization. Teddy,
no, that's fair.
Jamarl was saying a bunch of
I didn't want to mischaracterize, but I understand the difference. Basically, one is just, the other one is poor outcome. And I think you even said that you don't necessarily like the outcomes of this stuff because those things usually get bad, basically. So.
Yeah, and it's not just the deaths; it's what comes on the other side of the deaths. The deaths are bad enough, and then there's again, I've already made this case a couple times though. Teddy, if the cause were different, coming back to Jamarl's point, if they were attempting this, if they were trying to do this, but they had other reasons for doing it. It wasn't just about claiming Trump's victory, claiming that the election was stolen from him, but like Jamarl was saying, if they were protesting against the conditions created by the pandemic and the government's response to it, and the fact that the government still had not provided them with either economic security or, healthcare, Medicare for all, that kind of thing. Would you see this differently? How do you see it now, and how would that change it? How would that affect your view of it, Teddy?
So just for the record, like I said, I was there that day. The people that I talked to, this is not a scientific poll, obviously. Just the sample size was definitely not big enough for me to arrive at a conclusive, statement one way or the other. But the folks that I did talk to were not just there just because they were pissed off that Trump got cheated, right? They were there. A lot of them were anti-war. A lot of them were anti this push to get everyone vaccinated. In fact, that's why I was there. I was handing out cards telling folks, before you do anything, be informed. And here's an interview that I did with two doctors, and this whole idea of injecting your body with messenger RNA, a science that is not scientific at all. Be careful about that. And everyone that I was giving those cards out to, by the way, were very much on board with that line of thinking. So a lot of the people that were there were also there against this rush to vaccinate. A lot of people were against the idea of big government and how, even with this round of stimulus, how the vast majority of the wealth was doled out to corporate entities and we're getting pittances. So they were not single issue protesters. A lot of them were poor. And actually, I was surprised to find about 20 to 30% were actually African Americans. So they were not single issue and they were not unitary in terms of complexion either. But to your point, Shane, going back to what I also iterated earlier, I do not believe in revolutions. Revolutions always return back to the tyranny that gave birth to them. That was the case also in 1776. America was founded under this idea of a revolution that was supposed to be for the people. And really, if those who actually know the history of America's Revolutionary War, it was not even about unfair taxes. In fact, the founders of this country, who were a bunch of bootleggers, got pissed off when King George lifted the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, and that took away, mainly the Sugar Act, because that took away from their profit margin of the alcohol they were selling on the black market. So, I'm hip to what with this whole idea of painting the Revolutionary War as some type of a rising up of the people that were oppressed. That's a lie. There was the aristocracy versus the King George, and nothing has fundamentally changed in America as a result of that. In fact, another revolution was almost in the offing, not less than 10, 15 years later in America, the Shays Revolution or Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, and they got snuffed out by George Washington, another King George. So it is what it is in America. But like I said, I go back to the idea that if people are saying I've had enough, I don't care. I'm like Fred Hampton in that way. Fred Hampton in the 1960s sat down with I think they were called the Proud Boys even then. And he sat down under a Confederate flag and said, I don't care what your skin color is. I don't care what your political ideology is. I care that poor white people and poor black people are being oppressed. And I'm here in solidarity in that way. That's what I'm about as well. So I don't care if some hick in Alabama is pissed off at government and saying that he wants a fair shake. I don't care. I don't even care, to be honest with you. Who's the biggest supremacist in America? Is it some marginalized fringe white person in Alabama, or the people that govern us without our consent? Yeah, people really need to reassess and refocus on who the actual cancer is. That is not some marginalized, white guy in Tennessee. It's not. They're not coming for us. You want to know who's coming for us? It's the ones that have the monopoly of force, and they could deploy the military at their whim. They could tax us to death, and they could take away our livelihoods anytime they want to through fiscal monetary policies. So focus on that, and focus less on these bogeymen that are being created to distract us from the truth.
Look, I agree with you, Theodros. I've said on more than one occasion that the white guy that hates my guts, him and I have probably more in common from the standpoint of economic standpoint than anything else, especially from the standpoint of the elites or pretty much anybody that's in the congressional or politics. So that part I agree with you on. And it would be great if people recognize that. Like, it was like the day that the Proud Boys were marching and fighting on D.C., 4,000 people died. And you try to, it's like, wait, 4,000 people died from this virus, more people than died from 9/11 on that particular day, and this has been taking place like every day, and these guys are fighting each other on the streets of D.C. Why? Not for that. So it is weird and bizarre, and there is this kind of association with people that for whatever particular reason, they find other things to matter more than the commonalities of us as people. How do we get over it? I mean, at the end of the day, I do think there is, with that commonality, why isn't that commonality more seen? Why isn't it more understood? Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you really think this is just division that is being stoked from the standpoint of media and everything else that keeps people divided? How do you view this, and how do we, let's say, mind the gap? How do we overcome it?
So first and foremost, there's nothing more powerful in the history of humanity, and you know this, both of you are in the same industry, as media. Napoleon Bonaparte said, I fear three or four newspapers more than 10,000 bayonets for a reason.
Well, I love that. And Lenin made a similar statement too. Made the point that the media is basically a weapon or military, and we can't allow the bourgeois to keep their hands on it.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that, and then there's a reason why Twitter has reverted into the censorship of Facebook, and Facebook has reverted to the censorship of the German Stasi. Is because the minute that information actually has the potential of being controlled, and narratives can no longer dominate our lives, then things change. So that's what this is about. And this is why media has been weaponized to such an extent, right? To the point where, America has been completely divided based on endless identities that are completely manufactured. I mean, race is a caste system that was created by racists and slave traders. And yet here we are calling ourselves colors that don't even identify the true nature of who we are. And look how many endless lists of identities are being constructed every year.
1 minute.
More identities than there are people almost these days. So why is that? Because the media loves to create these divisions as a business plan, because that's how you create demographics, to cater to a demographic, and by vilifying the others. And the others because they're serving the interest of the corporate state. And the interest of the corporate state demand that we stay divided as a people. They divide us, we conquer ourselves. So if we really want to know, hey, how do we overcome this? It starts within each one of us. Understand that person that you're hating in abstraction is a human being just like you, is a father just like you, a mother just like you, has a child just like you, and they struggle to feed and provide for their families. If you understand, I interviewed Marcia Jackson once.
I love that point. They're still human beings regardless of what you think about them, and that in and of itself should allow a certain ability to understand where they're coming from. I appreciate that. The voice that you guys have been listening to is Theodros Fikre, co-founder and former editor of theguionjournal.com. You can follow Theodros Fikre on Twitter at Theodros Fikre and find his column at The Guion Journal. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for our last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and more from across both sides of the political aisle and all sides of the political spectrum. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, going into the headlines this morning. First up in the news, at least 2,048 new coronavirus deaths and 222,900 new cases were reported yesterday, January 11th, in the United States. Over the past week, there has been an average of about 250,000 cases per day, an increase of 37% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Tuesday morning, more than 22,673,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and more than 376,000 have died from it. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa extended coronavirus restrictions in the country Monday, citing a quote-unquote massive increase in COVID-19 cases driven by a variant discovered there last year. The current measures were due to expire on January 15th and included closing beaches and public parks and banning the sale of alcohol. In addition to extending the existing measures, Ramaphosa announced that 20 land borders will be closed until February 15th. Malaysia's king declared a nationwide state of emergency today to curb the spread of COVID-19, a move that bolsters Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin's hold on power and forestalls any attempt by opponents to force an early election. Muhyiddin said the parliament will be suspended for a period of time and that elections would not be held during the emergency, which could last until August 1st. The Disneyland Resort in Anaheim, California will soon be transformed into a mass coronavirus vaccination site for Southern California residents, Orange County officials announced on Monday. Indiana is the latest state to report its first case of a more contagious COVID-19 variant first identified in the United Kingdom, upping the total of states that have identified the strain up to 10. Two Democratic Congresswomen, Representative Pramila Jayapal of the Seattle area and Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman of New Jersey, she's 75 by the way, have both tested positive for COVID-19 after sheltering in place with fellow lawmakers during the attack on the U.S. Capitol last week. In national political news, President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence spoke Monday evening in the Oval Office, their first meeting since the assault on the U.S. Capitol last week. House Republicans, meanwhile, blocked a resolution from Democratic Representative Jamie Raskin to call on Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove the president from office. Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said the House will vote today and could proceed with impeachment if Pence doesn't act. Yesterday, U.S. President-elect Joe Biden announced William Burns as his pick to lead the CIA. Burns is a former ambassador to Russia and Jordan who helped lead secret talks with Iran. Burns, in partnership with Biden's nominee for Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, will likely be tasked with attempting to rebuild the U.S. spy community's reputation. I just want to pause for a second on that last phrase. Rebuild it into what? Like, when did maybe I'm too young or something. I don't get when the U.S. spy community, for the most part, had a positive representation. I guess just during the Cold War era, when it was like, a battle between spies, and James Bond was still in the mind of, so much of the world. And so there's this sort of glorification of the whole Anglo-American intelligence establishment. Maybe, I guess. But for all of my life, the vast majority of people I've known have been suspicious of the U.S. spy community. And frankly, if the spy community faced a sharp downturn in terms of its reputation, it wasn't under Trump. It was with the Snowden revelations and with Assange and with just everything that's happened, over the last decade, really. Jamarl, maybe I'm missing something here. What's your take?
Yeah, I don't know when this glory days of the spycraft stuff was in. I mean, the entire point of the spy was you weren't supposed to be known, right? You're supposed to be cloak and dagger. I don't know when this period took place. I mean, when if you're talking about the Kennedy period, where all of the information came out, where Kennedy basically went to war with the CIA, that didn't look all that good for them. I don't know when this period existed. I just honestly don't. And I've followed this stuff for a while. So, and like you said, it definitely wasn't under Trump.
Anyway, next time.
It definitely wasn't, this didn't happen under Trump. I know they want to put everything under the Trump umbrella. It was all Trump's fault. No, not so much.
In our next headline, former Republican Congressman Ron Paul says he's been blocked by Facebook from managing his account over repeated violations of the social media giant's community standards. And a quote here from Paul, who's writing on Twitter on Monday, quote, "With no explanation other than repeatedly going against our community standards, Facebook has blocked me from managing my page. Never have we received notice of violating community standards in the past, and nowhere is the offending post identified," end quote. The column that Paul had posted Monday to his Facebook page, again, the same day as this ban came through, was about tech censorship, particularly by Facebook and Twitter. So assuming this wasn't a glitch, which, you want to keep that in the running, but I'm not going to assume that. This is Facebook banning a leading libertarian figure, a leading political figure in his own way in the United States for talking about tech censorship. It's censored for talking about censorship. Anyway, in international political news today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu changed his cover photo on Twitter, which was a joint photo of himself sitting next to Trump at a White House meeting. It is now a picture of Netanyahu receiving the vaccine with the phrase, quote, "Citizens of Israel, we are returning to life," end quote. And this, of course, comes as Israel is way at the head of the pack, way ahead of the rest of the pack in terms of the per capita vaccination rate around the world. The head of Egypt's Civil Aviation Authority, Ashraf Noyer, announced on Tuesday that Cairo had resumed air service with Qatar and lifted the air embargo imposed on flights of Qatar's airlines to the North African country following the over 3-year freeze. In 2017, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt cut diplomatic ties with Qatar, accusing it of meddling and sponsoring terrorism. Several other countries later did the same, while all others downgraded their diplomatic ties with Doha and introduced a total blockade of the country. Doha has consistently denied the accusations, insisting that the neighbor's discontent with its economic successes was instead behind their hostile policies. So basically, the claim is you're jealous of us, and that's why you're doing it. Anyway, last headline here, real quick in tech news. Facebook announced on Monday that it will begin removing any and all content that contains the phrase, quote unquote, "stop the steal" from its platform in the days leading up to Inauguration Day on January 20th. 2021. And I want to talk about that for a few minutes. But with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So Jamarl, we've had conversations with guests about this over the past, four or so days on the air. tech censorship, the rise of this stuff, where this is going to go in a Biden administration and in general in the future. And I think we're in agreement pretty much across the board here that it's not going to go anywhere good. It's worrying. There's a lot of bad stuff happening on that front. And that, last Wednesday's event, the breach of the Capitol building, the riot effectively in the Capitol building, that will serve as an accelerant for this negative trend in terms of how tech treats the speech of average, everyday folks. I'm curious, though. Anything? I mean, again, we've had that conversation before. Anything you want to add? Anything that you think, anywhere you think this is particularly going to take us, or I'm just trying to turn it over to you. Basically, what do you think about this? Because it seems like with them banning the phrase "stop the steal," it's getting rid of individuals, cutting off general topics of conversation, targeting hashtags and phrases to try to prevent people from saying certain things, all from this sort of public policy manicured overlord way of controlling what people are allowed to say online.
It's weird and it's problematic. I mean, look, you're always going to have people who disagree with certain positions. You're always going to have people who are somewhat alienated. And technology has basically allowed this kind of weird quirk where we can almost like manicure that stuff out. So we don't want to hear it, so we're going to put in certain keywords that are just not allowed anymore. Like, that stuff gets really weird when we start airbrushing out commentary and conversation, even though I understand where they're coming from on it, if that makes sense. Like, if you're in tech, you're stuck with a problem. If you have, let's say, a site, or if you have some kind of system that would allow people to accrue and say, hey, let's go murder Todd, well, clearly that's going to be a problem. And no site, be it Twitter, Facebook, or any particular tech company, for financial reasons, not just for this kind of legal reason, want something like that taking place. But then you get into subjective speech that is not specific, but there's a subjectivity to it. And you get people, let's say like in the Biden administration, that may look at that speech and say, hey, even that's too far. It's a slippery slope. Clearly, it's a slippery slope. And you will have elements of the Democratic Party, you would have elements of the quote woke crowd that will say these subjective levels of speech are too far. And they would have tech companies do this stuff. And it won't stop there. It will go into just political opposition, political enemies. Is it possible that Sanders railing against the media gets added into that, even though he's perfectly right to rail against the media? Does it get into other populist movements that, let's say, are on the left? Do they start getting hit by some of the rhetoric going after, let's say, the political establishment, where the political establishment tries to make the point of saying, hey, that sounds a lot like the people who are talking about Trump? No, I think this can go into bad and weird ways, especially from the standpoint of censorship. But you are stuck with a problem. You don't necessarily want a situation where, these extremist groups or right-wing militias organize on your site. Nobody is going to want that. And so it's like, is there a middle ground to it? To make this argument of being a free speech extremist seems lazy, because clearly there's some levels of speech that any particular site is not going to want. By the same token, do you really want tech companies being overlords of this stuff? Meaning, do you really want tech companies being the deciding factor in what gets said and how it's said? And by the way, over government.
I think it's pretty much anybody.
Well, because Angela Merkel even had an issue with this. She doesn't like Trump. And she was like, whoa, I have an issue with, there's problems with that. Yeah, there are problems with that. There are. But go for it. I'm sorry.
Here's the thing. No, you're good. I was kind of cutting in there. But you say tech companies. I don't see how the tech companies would be doing this if there weren't a long run chronic pressure from the government for them to do this.
But it's not just government. That's what I mean. It's not just government. Like, those tech companies have all sorts of financial relationships with various other groups and everything else. If your company, advertisers, for example, but if your tech company gets affiliated with what it seems to be an attack on the Capitol, oh, that looks bad. You don't need government to intercede to do that, to have other, let's say, advertisers or people in general to be greatly bothered by the association. That's what I mean. This is not just government at this point. Government basically is going to get a reason and a rationale for exactly what just took place. I'm telling you, look back at left-wing groups that have tried to overstep. You get government response, and that government response gets the backing of the public that says, yes, respond. That's the problem with this, right? It's not entirely just government.
Here's where I'm coming with this one. This doesn't have anything unique to do with profit. In fact, as far as I can tell, this has nothing to do with the nature of profit itself. This has to do with culture or the government at large pressuring, really government or culture at large, pressuring any organization, whether it's a nonprofit, admittedly these companies are companies, but whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit organization, from abetting this stuff. And from my perspective, it seems to be largely pushed by the government and by certain wings of culture, not the majority of people, but certain groups who, really don't like tech companies or tech companies being allowed to do this stuff. And when I say being allowed to do this stuff, I really just mean allowing other people to use their platforms to do this stuff. So again, I don't think this has anything to do with profit. Like, in other words, would a nonprofit company not come under the same amount of pressure if their platform was being used by pro-Trump, organizers to try to organize this march that ended up breaching the White House? Say if Facebook were magically replaced by a nonprofit organization, I would see them coming under the exact same amount of pressure, if not more.
No, I agree, but I don't think that's entirely government. I mean, when you get the public that is greatly bothered by what happened, then you don't need a government for that. At that point, you have public pressure that is basically saying, do something. Meaning the public inches its way into something that is not all that great. That's what I'm thinking. Because let's say the government wasn't a part of this. Would you have the public itself being very bothered that either Facebook, Twitter, and these other companies are being used to organize events that are basically violent insurrections? And if that's true, and by the way, you may have the company itself that's bothered by it. Look, I've been a software engineer. I've said in the meetings, those companies do care about how those platforms are being used and what they're being used for. They have the individuals who own those things have ideologies on their own. I guess I'm saying it's not entirely just government that is putting pressure on these guys. Don't get me wrong, when Biden...
No, 100%.
They will be. But some of this stuff is just ideology in and of itself. Some of this stuff is how the public perceives it. No, Trump jumped the shark. That's basically what this boils down to. And the response by government with a Democrat president, Senate, and House of Representatives is going to be vicious in response. So...
100%. And we are, by the way, continuing this conversation on the other side of this break with our guest, Peter Coffin. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio and video. Also, if you want to join in on the conversation, you give us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. But joining us is Peter Coffin, video essayist with 250,000 YouTube subscribers, podcaster, and author. In their book, Custom Reality and You, they explore how reality works in a world where profit is the driving force. Relatable humor and a commitment to everyday people keeps their left perspective fresh, fun, and most importantly, sharp. Peter, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I love the name of that, Custom Reality and You, how reality works, where profit is the driving force and basically what the person sees. It's like this layer between reality and the individual, where that reality is basically being influenced by the profit motive. I'm fascinated by that. How does this relate with what we're seeing with Trump? I've been having a hard time processing my thinking on the censorship stuff after the fact, because I'm one of those people that typically believe that free speech is better. More likely than not, it's a better alternative, especially from the standpoint of repression. By the same token, I do see the logic of reality if something is causing or is creating a public threat. Let's go kill Todd, that for example, and the subjectivity around that. So how do we process everything that is taking place from the standpoint of the repression and the censorship as a backlash, but also dealing with the Trump era and how big tech is basically now all at once decided that Trump is no longer a thing?
Well, I think that probably the most interesting thing to think about is that the power that they have to literally shut the president of the United States off is the same power that they had to keep him on. Twitter and all other social media platforms, which are mainstream, are privately held property. They're companies that are unaccountable to the public in terms of who makes decisions. They're the people who own them make those decisions, and by proxy, the people that they employ. In 2015, I wrote an article called either enforce the rules or don't have them. And the point of it was essentially that the terms of service, which Donald Trump has broken at least once during the last 4 years, and people have complained about it and said you need to ban him off the platform. They don't exist because they're actual standards that are being put forward. They're more or less an excuse to have legitimacy when they get rid of somebody who's no longer useful for them. And in my eyes, every single time they have not banned him is an inconsistency with their terms of service, which is an exertion of their power. Now, my problem here isn't necessarily that I think that there's even when people say things like it's a private platform, they have the right to do whatever they want on it. That's technically true by the standards of our current society. But it's not true that they actually enforce rules in a manner that is consistent. What they do is they see this figure who creates tons of engagement, who draws tons of attention to their platform, and they know that it's useful. And every single day they made the decision to exert the power that their TOS doesn't apply to this person, and it does apply to, ex-Palestinian who's trying to say that Israel is killing them, or whatever. It applies in a manner that it benefits them, and it keeps the conversation engagement focused, conflict focused, so that people are constantly arguing, staying on the platform, getting obsessed. And for me, we could argue about free speech. There's a lot of people who say this is an equivalent of yelling fire in a movie theater, which is not free speech in a lot of people's opinion. The stuff that Trump has done over the last 4 years to sort of egg his support on into more actual action. But I would say that it doesn't even get to that point because we aren't even addressing the fact that power has concentrated to the point where this unaccountable private entity has the ability to make the decision who their rules apply to and when they apply that power. For me, it's utterly unfair in that respect that they're most likely making decisions based on whether or not they are benefiting from having that person on platform rather than they give us a set of standards that we can sort of apply.
But so here's a question, though. Does it actually make any difference at this point? I mean, my take is, while admittedly there would be some means of recourse for the public to express their interests, wishes, needs through the levers of Congress by electing officials in or by referenda, that's not happening. That's not going to happen in any time in the near future. So practically, does it make any damn difference whether the tech companies are doing this, whether governments are doing this? I guess what I'm worried about, and what it seems like we're very quickly approaching, is a complete merger between the interests and the ownership of the government and of these tech companies. So that what we get is what another I think yesterday I called Techno-Fascism. It seems like we're already in the early to middle stages of that, something like that.
I would heavily agree.
Yeah, what's your take, Peter?
I think that there's a major confluence of interests in both Democrat and Republican Congress people, both in the House and Senate, that lines up with both Silicon Valley, because Silicon Valley donates pretty indiscriminately to a lot of different politicians. I know that they've made a big show about how they're not going to donate to certain Republicans now because of their affiliation with Trump. But the fact is that money goes into various campaigns and super PACs and PACs for a lot of different politicians that are operating. A lot of those politicians, not all of them, but a lot of them kind of come from that same milieu of the Pete Buttigieg type that has a lot of intersection with like the intelligence community, which the intelligence community and the Silicon Valley sort of surveillance apparatus, their interests are very similar, and one contracts the other to do a lot of their work. So, you kind of can see that there's a cyclical sort of, I hesitate to use the word like just cyclical moving of money, because it's not just money, but there's a major confluence of interests between these three large factors of the United States way of life, so to speak, that I would say, yes, like we are very much looking at this sort of, if not official merger of the state and capital, then an alignment that, I mean, the liberal apparatus, the Democratic Party, is very, very Silicon Valley focused. And to have all of the interests of these entities, like the quote unquote intelligence community, the Silicon Valley, and a lot of people that are in Congress that are both sympathetic to the intelligence community and take lots of money from Silicon Valley, we are moving in that direction. I entirely agree.
I mean, and I think it's even worse than that on some level. If we're thinking of how the influence of tech, let's say in the United States, well, that's also true in other countries. I mean, if they can basically get rid of the president of the United States, which is basically what they did, everybody's fair game.
Yeah.
Like, if Twitter in the U.S. can nix the president. And so the question becomes, this is now a power center. Tech, or let's say technology, in and of itself becomes one of the other power centers in regards to people being able to get their point out. And this is not just in the U.S. Angela Merkel, again, made an issue with this, saying, well, that's kind of problematic because Merkel knows that Germany could also be held to that. So how should this be dealt with? I mean, like you made the point before. I remember when they got rid of Telesur because for hashtag reasons, or Press TV, for example, gets nixed off of Twitter. And it's like, why are you guys doing that? Oh, because they're presenting a point of view that goes contrary to the U.S. government. Like, we have to think about this stuff, not just on the right, but also on the left, and how the powers that we distribute to tech, how those powers are going to be used. Now, let me ask you this. So what should be done? should it be a public utility? Should laws be passed to make it far more clear that this is a platform for public discourse and not entirely just this kind of profit-making mechanism to which it started off as? How should this be regarded in a way to try to, I guess you could say, mind the issues that are associated with giving big tech this much power?
Now, I would definitely agree that it being a public utility would be a better situation, but I have a feeling it wouldn't solve the particular problem we're talking about, because it ultimately, like, again, the people who are taking power at the moment, and really their opponents too, but really particularly the Democrats, they're very oriented towards this managerial perspective in which we're all like, you can't really help any of our viewpoints. We were all kind of just like either born or indoctrinated very early into whatever, and it's impossible for people to change. So what we really have to do is manage these people. I think that same viewpoint would be applied if it was a public utility. It would at least be accountable to government, in which case, like, I mean, it's not to say that we live in what I would call a fully functioning democracy, but you would have some ability to remove people and insert people that, you know, have different viewpoints than that managerial standpoint. However, the way I am looking at it is, I think that would probably be a marginal improvement, but not a big one. Unfortunately, like, I think that unless we do something that's a lot more drastic in transforming our economic and social our economic system and our social contract, I would say we're really headed down, like, the way the system is right now. All of the people who hold power are really going to take us down the path that was mentioned earlier. And people, I think, really need to wake up to the fact that the Democrats are not their friends. Like, they're not more friendly than the other side either. And all of these things that people have been celebrating over the last, you know, several days, like the state exerting power on like extrajudicially killing somebody, like that's not a good thing. It's not, I mean, do I care about what ideology it's exerted on? I actually don't. When I see the state being able to make the decision to kill somebody, that scares me. When I see those interests lining up with private interests, that scares me. The private interests being what we've been discussing this whole time.
So let's do this. Let's talk about that when we come back. This kind of merger between big tech and government in this case, because I agree. In fact, I don't even know if it's a marginal improvement. If we look at like the post office and we look at some of these other organizations where political and ideological actors capture the means by which we're supposed to be, you know, governing these particular organizations. Meaning Twitter could have became a more ideological platform, in a sense of getting rid of, let's say, Black Lives Matter, or getting rid of Antifa people, or getting rid of whatever, and vice versa, this kind of flip-flopping. So I agree with you. It might have even made it worse in an odd way. Let's do this. Let's take a break, and we'll bring you back. The voice that you guys have been listening to is Peter Coffin, video essayist with over 250,000 YouTube subscribers, podcaster, and author. In their book, Custom Reality and You, they explore how reality works in a world where profit is the driving force. Relatable humor and commitment to everyday people keeps their left perspective fresh, fun, and most importantly, sharp. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunday, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet.
internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined by Peter Coffin, video essayist with over 250,000 YouTube subscribers, podcaster, and author. Also, again, author in their book, Custom Reality and You. They explore how reality works in a world where profit is the driving force. And by the way, you can follow Peter on YouTube, Patreon, and Twitter, at Peter Coffin, and purchase his book on Amazon. Peter, it seems to me that the sort of, the ostensible order that we're living under right now, sort of liberal democratic order, it's one word for it, is built foundationally on this idea that a government is, it inevitably picks its legitimacy up from, it inevitably is derived from the deliberations of sort of more or less rational actors, more or less reasonable people who can have conversations and share ideas and talk about things in public fora, and then through talking about those things, vote certain people into office and certain actions into passing, and that through that process you get representative government, through referenda you get certain direct votes, and that overall what this leads to is a representation of the interests of people. It seems to me like in the last century, and again that ideology is far older than this last century, the 20th century. But it seems to me like in the 20th century, with the development of advertising and propaganda, sort of under the surface of our attention, that order has faced serious blows. And it seems to me that right now, with sort of algorithmically determined ways of keeping people from being able to talk about certain things or consider certain perspectives because elites frankly don't trust them to do so, like one of the pivotal, if not the pivotal underlying assumption for that prevailing order has been crushed. I don't know how else to put it. And I don't have a term for what's come on the other side. We use the term techno-fascism, but that's sort of like an economic, social term in some sense. What I'm talking about is more like a politically philosophical term for the order that we're currently living in, which is the public's opinion is largely managed. It's constrained not only by media companies, but by the fiat of various governments. And through this process, I guess I want to turn it over to you. What do you agree with there? What do you disagree with there? And where does this take us? For the most part, I think people have people are more or less aware of the idea that they can only learn so much. They're only being given so much information by the establishment media and by media in general. But where does this take us? And how do you see this playing out? It's a kind of a bigger question. But in the coming century and coming decades, how do you see people reacting to this? What do you see this whole process looking like from different sides of the situation, Peter?
Well, my book, Custom Reality and You, is kind of about how we're sort of tasked with the labor of creating a reality for ourselves with very limited tools and information. It seems, and the point is that it's not actually custom, it's more we do the labor of it, so it seems like it's our decision. But the way that I think that ultimately takes us is that you have a lot of people who believe they're fiercely independent, that believe that they are making the best decisions and being very smart and very intelligent to a lot of different people. And they fiercely defend the idea that they are rational actors in, this, what you described. Like, most people would say ideologically that they are exactly what you described right there. And I think that, this is a really interesting thing, because Twitter is, again, kind of an apparatus to enforce that mechanic that I just described as well. And where that takes us is to an easily controllable and manageable populace. You see, the increasing polarization where all of these folks are fighting with each other constantly, and that's profitable for the companies, of course. But it's also, you have clear lines between factions, and you have arguments that ultimately don't really have anything to do with the way that society is run, rather aesthetics and sort of surface level versions of whatever issue might actually exist. Example of that being racism, for instance. Like, you have people arguing over whether it's good or bad to be racist, rather than how racism is an integral systemic justifying ideology. What you end up, I think, with is that you'll have people defending this order as it comes to crystallize itself. I think that you'll have people who are ushering it in because aesthetically, like, it does things that please them, like, removing Trump. I don't feel like it's really that hard to say, oh, well, that's cool. Because, like, I don't like Donald Trump. I don't like what he stands for and all of that. But at the same time, I don't look at it from an analysis of, like, individually, do I think that it is fun or not fun that there is no more Donald Trump? I look at it from a perspective of, what kind of power is necessary to remove the president of the United States from your platform and not have, like, every lever of institutional power work against you from that point forward. I think that, unless we're able to find some alternate means of accessing the everyday normal person and, getting some kind of criticism out there that is, showing this stuff for what it is and kind of directing people towards a program of resisting it and finding avenues where people can collectivize and actually exert power against the power structure. I think unless we can do that, we're just going to watch people, like, endorse this and go down that rabbit hole. And I don't know where it stops, to be honest with you.
Twitter, Facebook, these social media organizations look like they would have been an amazing tool to organize and push back against elements of a system that aren't necessarily all that great. And what it seemed to end up doing, like you said, is end up having, like, I've stood by for the last, 2-3 weeks, almost a month, and watched the left eat each other over a force the vote campaign. And it was not enough to be for it, and the way it was put out, either you were for it on every measure, otherwise you were attacked, or you're against it on every measure, otherwise you were attacked. And these groups just ate each other for, like, weeks, and nothing became of it. It was an expenditure of energy, and it was an expenditure of energy that was basically allowed by the social media site. Didn't cause it, but definitely basically allowed it. I think it's agnostic in a certain way. It does allow you to organize your energies in a way that can go after a system, but it can also allow your energies to be organized against each other. It's kind of like technology in general. I guess the basic question, more than anything else, is how do people get over the hump and get their heads right? I don't know how to explain it. I mean, when I saw all of those people raid the Capitol, the shocking thing to me wasn't that they were angry. It wasn't that they raided the Capitol. It was the reason they did it. And I would imagine that a lot of people over the course of the year have been very angry, very upset, and you've seen all of these protests. How do we get the real world basic reality? And is there going to be a push to try to get back to it? Like usually there's these kind of pushbacks against any kind of thing or any kind of order that comes into play. I think we're going to see somewhat of a retaliation against basically the putsch that we just, that failed. But is there going to be a backlash against this thing of just trying to hit what's real? Because I think, honestly, around the wings, whether it's the Trump protests or whether it was the protests that have been taking place over the course of the year, it's been trying to get at this reality of sorts that this isn't right. How we've been organized. It's not right. It's not working. That's what I think the ultimate underlying thing is, even though that's not usually the way it's explained or the way it's articulated. What do you think about it?
Well, I think that, it takes a lot to sort of actually resist what is in place, because while it's probably in terms of like people enforcing rules and things like that, probably pretty agnostic. It being agnostic kind of benefits the mode that is sort of dictated by these platforms in the first place, which is one of atomization. It's one of conflict. Conflict is very incentivized on these platforms. It can get you a lot of social capital. To me, like the thing that we really need to start doing is forming cohesive political entities that are able to organize, fundraise, and all of that are not privately owned like an NGO or an NPO. I would say that forming more specifically radical political parties that are not oriented towards electoralism and are oriented towards, forming real community and finding ways to organize power against the power structure, like actually withholding labor, or in a lot of cases, like look back at the civil rights movement. What was done was not just people marching. There was also, socialist parties that were organizing labor to withhold. There was actual like violent protests that happened. There were, the blocking of roads. There were things that went far beyond the narrative of the civil rights movement that we're constantly taught. And that is the stuff that's necessary for, like, we are still necessary for the system to perpetuate itself and go on as normal, whether that's our consumption, whether that is our labor, whatever. Like, if we are able to, in an organized fashion, rather than this individualized, atomized stuff, that the sort of influencer mode where like somebody on Twitter says, stop eating meat, and like yells at people for eating meat, and individually people make decisions about whether they should eat meat. We need to be organizing blocks of people to exert power on the structure, and I understand that's a very like rudimentary sort of basic area of contention to go towards. But I feel that that's what we need to understand is necessary. We need to start doing things that clog up the gears. Like if
Peter, I'm going to have to interrupt you, but I think you're right. I think organization is the key to it. So absolutely. The voice that you guys have been listening to is Peter Coffin, video essayist with over 250,000 YouTube subscribers, podcaster and author. And their book, Custom Reality and You, they explore how reality works in a world where profit is the driving force. Relatable humor and the commitment to everyday people keeps their left perspective fresh, fun, and most importantly, sharp. You can listen to Peter or follow Peter on YouTube, Patreon, and Twitter at Peter Coffin, and purchase his book on Amazon. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment with the wrap.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on, man?
Good morning. I suggest everybody should read this article from Newsweek from January 10th, 2019. It's talking about the last march of Martin Luther King and how the FBI infiltrated it because Hoover had an idea. And the idea was to infiltrate it with informants, the invaders. There was a pro-black nationalist group that didn't agree with nonviolence. It was in a group, and they was infiltrated by a Memphis police officer. And you had the photographer of Martin Luther King was an informant of the FBI. And come to find out by reading the article, he was the main one trying to destroy that march. And the way it was done was wicked. Martin Luther King did not want to leave the march, but they forced him to leave, and then the FBI put out a rumor that he ran like a coward. And they used the same thing to drive a wedge between the black nationalists, like the Black Panthers and whatnot, against the nonviolent marches, MLK. That's what the FBI plot did. So if anybody want to tweet out something, tweet out that Newsweek article. If he get back on that platform, tweet out that and let everybody read that in other COINTELPRO programs that took place. Because you want to understand how the marches was being played for the whole year, when people start burning out police stations and this, that, and the other, then you do research on different areas of Minnesota that was being burnt down in that city, you find out they had other things going on. Well, you want to tear down them buildings to rebuild them anyway. Okay? So a lot of strange things going on. And I think COINTELPRO, in my opinion, is being involved. You have a lot of provocateurs, a lot of paid informants is doing things to destroy the justice movement, destroy the Medicare for All movement, destroy the election integrity movement dealing with still vote, to make it, to put us in one basket being crazy, and we're not crazy. Declassify COINTELPRO, assassinations of these expert people, MLK, Malcolm X, and others, John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy. And throughout time, as we go through the paperwork, then we'll see how it was manipulated, and this stuff will never happen again. That's all I got to say.
Reef, thank you for the call. Looking into that Newsweek article a little bit. I mean, we were talking about agent provocateurs on Friday before we went into the weekend. We closed out the show with call-in segments talking with Kim Iverson about agent provocateurs, and I think I was the only person who was saying I don't really buy into this argument. Here's one reason why. When people, I'll just make a brief parallel here. When people were alleging that there were agent provocateurs operating during the Black Lives Matter protest this summer, the argument they were making, as far as I can tell, is a lot of the folks who were doing damage, particularly sort of reckless damage, they were saying that the agent provocateurs were doing that. I don't see how you can get a group of thousands of people to break into the Capitol building with just a few people goading them on. I think there has to, even if you grant it for a second, which I don't, you'd have to show me proof. Just, still something I'd like to ask for when it comes to this kind of thing. There is ready willingness to do that by the bulk of the group. So even if I grant that there were a few people who were trying to goad that group into action, namely, obviously, Giuliani, Donald Trump Jr., and Donald Trump himself, I'm still talking about the agent provocateurs here, they were right there. It was at a boiling point. And as we've said on the show, there are deeper reasons, underlying reasons why they would be at that level. It's not just Stop the Steal. It's the entire event of this year and the long run political degradation of the United States. I get that. And ultimately, the elites are more to blame for this than that individual group. But when it comes to people trying, as far as I can tell, trying to sort of excuse the actions of that group or trying to say that it was all put on or all inspired by agents who had infiltrated the crowd to try to goad them into action, I don't buy that argument. Jamarl, what's your take?
I don't buy that argument either. I don't buy that argument at all. The agent provocateurs was Donald Trump telling them that the Cubans and the communists was working with Governor Kent to steal the election from him. That was the agent provocateur. And stoking that for months, for like 2 months, saying, oh, I didn't lose this race. This race was stolen. It was stolen. And every speech that Donald Trump gave basically was, I'm being robbed. He even was pushing Pence to try to, steal it, pushing the Republicans, calling, like with the threats of, hey, if you don't do this, this is a criminal thing. If you don't, to find me all of these votes that I need to get it. No, I don't buy the provocateur stuff. Not for this. No, I think Donald Trump got those people into this frenzied mindset that A, the election was stolen, or B, we're going to be there for Trump whether we believe it was stolen or not. And if for a lot of these people, I don't think it mattered one way or the other where it was stolen. This is kind of like Russiagate stuff, or Obama's a Muslim. It's like whether he's a Muslim or not is less relevant than finding something to hit him with or to scream about. I think this was in similar vein. They showed up. This was not provocateurs. These were people who were revved up by the Trump administration. That's my thought. So I agree.
All right, here's another. We're taking calls 202-521-1320. Here's another question, Jamarl. What would you say to people who wanted the people raiding the Capitol building to take members of Congress hostage? What would you say to people who thought that the calls to violence against members of Congress against Vice President Pence were justified? Whether those people are on the left or on the right, because there are many on each side who see it as having been justified, who hate politicians' guts and think they deserve to die, to put it in the bluntest possible terms. What's your response to that? What do you think of that?
I mean, I think it's problematic, to put it mildly. I mean, look, I am one of those people who scream bloody murder at how politicians, their behavior, and how the choices that they make. Meaning, oftentimes, there seems to be this kind of disconnect between the individual versus the choices that the individual makes. So they would say, oh, George Bush is a great guy, despite the fact that George Bush pushes a button and kills 1 million Iraqis. So I get the logic of the argument. Their argument being, well, hey, if that individual is perfectly okay with taking certain actions, whether it's removing, let's say, Social Security and Medicare, doing things that kill people abroad and whatnot, that they should also be fair game. I think that's a problematic argument. I just think it's problematic, to put it mildly. If you're going to make that argument that people are basically fair game to be killed because of choices that they make, do you really want government to be at that particular level where any particular individual can say that somebody is guilty of any particular thing? I think it just goes to problematic consequences. And I don't necessarily buy that the country is on board for it. I just don't think that revolutionary justice is going to turn out in the positive way that people think it's going to turn out. That's my thought. The consequences of this stuff gets monstrous. Whale from the chat. Is Whale a caller? Whale, what's going on?
Hey, I want to argue against your the whole you don't believe it could be provocateurs. I have history behind me. Like the Black Panthers, they got radicalized by the Red Underground. In the beginning, they weren't violent like that. It was only when they started interacting with the Red Underground they started getting violent. Malcolm X.
Wait, just so we're clear. I think the issue that we're talking about is this is not necessarily just a group that has been formed, etc. This was a crowd that was revved up into a frenzy by Republicans in Congress and by the Trump administration himself, their speeches of all of these Congress members getting this crowd riled up. So the provocateur thing, I just don't buy. I don't even see why you need a provocateur in a situation like that. These guys were being egged on into the Capitol by people who were there. I'm sorry, I don't buy it. I mean, if we were at the crowd, say for example, a bunch of lefties was at the Capitol, and some people was like, hey, come on in. Would those lefties go? Yeah, some of them would. Would some act a fool? Yes. Do you need provocateurs for that? No. I just don't buy it. But please continue, Will. I just wanted to make our position clear. This wasn't a situation like the Black Panthers where things were happening over a period of time or group. These were multiple groups, some of which were extremists, some of which were violent extremist groups, that all were there backing their guy, Trump. That's the honest reality of it. I don't know, the provocateur stuff just seems extreme to me, especially when it doesn't necessarily seem to be evidence of it here, even if you could point to evidence in the past.
I agree it was Trump's fault. I agree he spurred his base to storm the Capitol. I also know that the Pentagon was actually involved with the lowering the security of the Capitol Police. They like refused them to get riot gear. There's like a Washington Post article detailing about how right before the Capitol protest happened, the mayor of DC or something, she asked for increased security, and the Pentagon was like, no, they thought having military in the Capitol was a bad optics or something. So this was higher. This whole plan was like even more conceived than people think. I don't think it was provocateur doing the storming the Capitol, but I think they wanted people to go in there just so they could start up a whole narrative against Trump's base.
Well, thank you for the call. We got another caller. I mean, very briefly, the optical explanation there makes sense to me. But we have another one. David calling in from California. David, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, it's been a great show, guys. You guys are doing a great job. And I have a brief statement, and a suggestion for you guys. The statement is, I hope Sheldon Adelson is unresting in something completely unlike peace. But I doubt if that's the case. The suggestion is you guys need to get Cynthia McKinney on pretty much ASAP, because she's got a lot to talk about. And that's about it, guys. Thank you very much.
We will look into that.
Yeah,
David, thank you for the call.
She's great.
We're closing. She is. Yeah, Sam. We're closing today's show out. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thank you to producers Cameron and Raheem. Thank you, engineer Andre. Thank you to all of our guests this morning. And thank you, that is you, for listening. Oh, and Jamarl, thank you for co-hosting the show with me. We will be back tomorrow, folks. Have a great day. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Another one in the record books, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Guys, I want to thank all of you for being here. Like I typically thank all of you for being here. I like to say you guys make the show what it is, and I don't say that flippantly. I say that, God damn it, Google. I say that because it's true. I mean, the callers, the feedback, all of that stuff, especially when it's done in earnest and not people just fucking around, it actually does help. So whether we agree or disagree, it's appreciated. I'm trying to make sure. Okay, there we are. Sorry, I'm looking at the Google thing. All right, 312. Also, we've been growing in the number of people that have been joining us. So even with that, I want to also thank you guys for joining us in the mornings. For the blogosphere with the UFO for the thing right on. So we've all learned here is that the internet is shut down as such. The people, regardless of any self-perceived political affiliation, are on the same side, and the government is to get us all. That's not what you've learned. No, I think it's... Look, I think the issue is nuanced. Technology, I think, is agnostic in and of itself. But I do think there's an argument to be made that the people with, let's say, the money, or the people who are making the technology, or the people who own the technology, they have a reason for making it. And within the context of that reasoning, you have where it's going to go in a direction. I don't think that government is, quote unquote, out to get people. I think government and the people who are in government have their own political ideologies and things that they want to accomplish. But oftentimes those things are based around capital, the accumulation of capital, and basically ensuring that their oligarchs remain fat and wealthy. I think that's based on natural incentives, though. I don't think that's an issue of magic. I think that's the issue of what are the basic incentives and the drives in regards to our world. And the political structure tends to be the power center in regards to how resources are distributed in our system. It's just so happened that political structure depends and runs on cash, and the people with the cash wants to ensure that that cash continues to go in their direction. That's not necessarily magic. I don't think that's even necessarily mind-blowing if you ask people or talk to people who are basically on the streets. I think it's a fair point that a lot of people are pissed off with the way this society has been run. Do you believe the Black Lives Matter protesters had a point? I think they did. The people who are angry and at the Capitol, Theodros made the point of like, look, I talked to a lot of those people, and a lot of those people had a lot of issues. It wasn't just a single issue of the election being stolen. Fair enough. But whatever those people's issues were, the attacking the Capitol basically undermined their complaints. Now, I don't think it's that simplistic at all in regards to what's being said or what's being argued. I think Peter Coffin is trying to give this kind of nuanced perspective of what does it look like when technology merges with government. I think he's being fair and honest. Same thing. Jamarl, so they're out to get our money. Yes, I think that's fair. Joe Brown, I think that's fair, yes. I think that's fair. And even that's a little weirder. I mean, think about your world for a moment. And if you think back over the past, let's say 30, 40, 50 years, there's been an expropriation of cash from the poor and middle class to the top. I mean, even in a short span of time over the past year, with the thing of the virus and the way people have changed their shopping habits, and the companies and the businesses that were basically shut down, the retail shops. Well, you saw this kind of expropriation of money to the Bezoses of the world and so forth, because they had the infrastructure that could take advantage of the new environment and the way that people are buying and accruing their groceries and the resources. And so our system lumbers in that direction as is. I don't necessarily think it's mind-blowing to kind of point out that that seems to be the way it runs. If it's ever to change that, that would be a revolution. I mean, the last time that took place was the Civil War. This idea of blacks who were basically being commodified, the black body commodified and used as an item, like a goat or a cow. That being ripped away from the various slave masters was basically the removing of capital from the hands of people. It was a huge shift in income. Now, those things or those people that were commodities at that point became people, and they became dirt poor people who in many cases were still stuck on the various reservations that they worked, or the campaigns or the plantations that they worked. Well, you lumber on through history where you have this kind of skew in the way that resources are distributed, and that skew doesn't go anywhere, it just kind of stays there. Well, political argument or politics is the thing that tries to mediate the gap where that doesn't become somewhat of a war. And to make this matter worse, many of the people, the majority of the people that are poor in this country are white, because there just so happen to be more whites. But the levels of poverty that some of the African Americans or many African Americans deal with is just atrocious. And yeah, I think it's fair to say that Proud Boys, who were out there fighting and punching people in the face on a day where 4,000 people died, missed the fucking point. Even those people who are raiding the Capitol, and they're doing it to keep a man who was responsible for 300,000 deaths at the time, looks ridiculous. We got to get our shit together. And I mean this as a country, not just as a group or identity or anything else. And maybe the way to do that is not to form a new political clique or new political group, but maybe to fight on this idea of what you're trying to accomplish. Meaning, oftentimes you would have a politician that says, I'm a progressive or I'm this. I don't know what that means. If that person says, I am for Medicare for all, and that is my objective, that is my goal, that is the thing I'm here to accomplish, period. I know what that means. I understand what that means. And I think the public understands what that means. The public, in you accomplishing your objective, will allow you to accomplish other objectives within that line. I think the way to go about this is the people to extricate themselves from parties, and this idea that you're functioning in this kind of political clique of one of these established groups. I think you lose people like that. I think the way to do it is say, this is what I'm focused on. This is my objective. This is my goal. Kind of like Martin Luther King fighting for civil rights, or, I don't know, the women's rights or suffrage or the workers' rights. It's very specific in what you're trying to accomplish. That wasn't necessarily a political party. That was a movement focused on trying to get a goal or an objective accomplished. I would say that's the thing that has shown success in the past, and maybe that's the way we need to go with it. Eliminate, extricate yourselves from these political parties. They are not serving us. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all. I'll see you guys.